The moment my sister called me a pathetic loser at our family's Thanksgiving dinner, I knew my 3 years of careful planning were about to pay off in ways she could never imagine. Picture this, there I was sitting at the end of the table like always while my golden child sister Sarah basked in the family's praise for her incredible success at her dream job. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "Stop clinging to real success," she sneered loud enough for our entire extended family to hear. "It's embarrassing watching you pretend you matter." Our parents nodded in agreement. Our aunts and uncles looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and disappointment. Same song, different verse. I was the family failure, and Sarah was their shining star. But here's what none of them knew while they were celebrating Sarah's prestigious position at Harrison and Associates. I was the one who'd been signing her paychecks for the past 8 months. That's right, the pathetic loser they'd dismissed my entire life had secretly become her boss. And tomorrow morning when she opened that envelope and saw my signature staring back at her, her perfect little world was going to crumble. But that revelation, that was just the beginning. Because what happened next would expose decades of family lies, uncover betrayals that cut deeper than blood, and reveal secrets that would change everything we thought we knew about success, loyalty, and revenge. Stay with me, because this story has twists you'll never see coming, and an ending that will leave you cheering for justice, served ice cold. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 8 years I've been quietly building what most people would consider a very successful consulting business. But if you asked my family, they'd tell you I'm the disappointment who never amounted to anything. A narrative I've let them believe for reasons that will become clear soon enough. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced sweet potatoes filled my childhood home as I walked through the front door that Thanksgiving evening, carrying a bottle of expensive wine that I knew no one would acknowledge I could afford. The dining room buzzed with the familiar chaos of our annual family gathering. 23 relatives crowded around the mahogany table that had hosted 4 decades of holiday meals, their voices creating a warm symphony of laughter and conversation that somehow always seemed to quiet when I entered the room. "Emma's here," my mother announced with the same tone she might use to mention that the garbage truck had arrived. She was arranging the last of the side dishes, her silver hair perfectly styled and her holiday sweater immaculate as always. "Sarah's been telling everyone about her promotion at Harrison and Associates. Isn't that wonderful?" My sister Sarah looked up from her place of honor at my father's right hand, her blonde hair catching the chandelier light as she smiled that practiced smile she'd perfected sometime around high school. At 36, she had mastered the art of looking successful, designer dress, professional, manicure, confidence that filled the room like expensive perfume. She was holding court as usual, regaling our cousins with stories about her executive marketing position and the corner office she'd supposedly earned through sheer talent and determination. "Emma!" she called out, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my stomach clench. "Come sit down. We were just talking about real careers and what it takes to succeed in the corporate world." I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, the spot that had been mine since childhood, close enough to be included, but far enough away to be easily ignored. Uncle Robert was nodding approvingly at something Sarah had said about quarterly projections, while Aunt Margaret hung on every word about Sarah's recent business trip to Chicago. My cousins David and Jennifer listened with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for celebrities, occasionally glancing my way with expressions that mixed pity with mild curiosity about what the family failure was doing these days. "So, Emma," my father said, his voice carrying that familiar note of forced patience, "still doing that little bookkeeping thing of yours?" Before I could answer, Sarah let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Dad, please, let's not pretend Emma's playing in the same league as the rest of us." She turned to face me directly, her green eyes sparkling with malicious delight. "I mean, it's sweet that you're still trying, but honestly, you're a pathetic loser who needs to stop embarrassing the family with your failures." the table fell silent except for the soft clink of silverware against china. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, waiting to see how I'd react to this public humiliation. It was a familiar ritual, Sarah establishing dominance, the family watching to see if I'd finally fight back or continue to accept my designated role as the disappointment. "Sarah, really," my mother said, but her tone suggested she was more concerned about maintaining dinner conversation than defending me. "That's a bit harsh." "Is it, though?" Sarah continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train picking up speed. "I'm making 6 figures in a prestigious firm, managing million-dollar campaigns and building real wealth. Meanwhile, Emma here is still pretending that her tiny client list somehow makes her a real businesswoman." She picked up her wine glass and took a deliberate sip. "It's actually kind of sad watching her cling to this fantasy of success when we all know she's barely keeping her head above water." The family members around the table shifted uncomfortably, but I noticed the subtle nods of agreement. My cousin David cleared his throat and changed the subject to the football game, but the damage was done. In their eyes, I could see the familiar mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment they'd been directing my way for years. I smoothed my navy blue silk blouse, the one that had cost more than most people's car payments, and adjusted the gold watch on my wrist that Sarah had dismissed as probably a knockoff when she first noticed it. The irony of the situation was so perfect it almost made me smile. Almost. "You're right, Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We definitely aren't playing in the same league." She smiled triumphantly, clearly interpreting my response as the surrender she expected. Little did she know that tomorrow morning when she opened her paycheck from Harrison and Associates, she'd see my signature at the bottom, the same signature I'd been putting on her paychecks for the past 8 months. But the signature on her paycheck wasn't the only secret I was hiding. After dinner, as the family dispersed into their usual post-meal routines, the men gravitating toward the living room television and the women clustering around the kitchen island with their coffee and gossip, I found myself standing alone in my father's old study. The room had remained virtually untouched since his death 3 years ago, still smelling faintly of his pipe tobacco and the leather-bound books that lined the mahogany shelves. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of family memories, that I allowed myself to remember how this favoritism had shaped every milestone of my childhood. The Academic Excellence Award ceremony from 8th grade came flooding back with crystal clarity. I had worked tirelessly that entire year, maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA, while Sarah struggled to keep her grades above C level. When the letter arrived announcing that I would be receiving the highest academic honor given to any student in the district, I remember rushing to my parents with the news, my 13-year-old heart bursting with pride, and the desperate hope that finally, I had done something worthy of their attention. "That's wonderful, sweetie," my mother had said, barely looking up from the laundry she was folding. "What day is the ceremony?" "Thursday at 7. I had replied, practically vibrating with excitement. "They said I'm the youngest student in school history to win this award." "Thursday." My father frowned, pulling out his calendar. "That's Sarah's regional soccer semifinals. You know we can't miss that." Died. Sarah's team was mediocre at best that season. She spent more time on the bench than on the field, and the semifinals ended up being a crushing defeat that knocked them out of any chance for state championships. But there they were in the stands cheering for their golden child, while I sat alone in the school auditorium accepting my award to an audience that included everyone's families except mine. The principal even commented afterward how sorry she was that my parents couldn't make it, assuming there must have been some emergency to keep them away from such an important moment. Even more painful was my 16th birthday, that milestone that's supposed to mark a girl's transition into young womanhood. It fell on May 15th, just 4 days before Sarah's high school graduation. For weeks leading up to it, I had dropped increasingly obvious hints about what I wanted: a small party, maybe dinner at my favorite restaurant, or even just acknowledgement that this was an important day in my life. Instead, my birthday arrived and departed like any other Tuesday, completely overshadowed by graduation preparations. "We'll celebrate next weekend," my mother promised absently as she hung Sarah's cap and gown in the closet. "After all this graduation craziness dies down." That celebration never happened. By the following weekend, they were too exhausted from Sarah's graduation party to think about birthday celebrations, and the moment passed into the growing collection of disappointments I was learning to carry alone. Sarah got a car for graduation, a shiny red Jeep Cherokee that she promptly wrecked 2 months later. I got a hastily purchased gift card to Target, presented 3 weeks late with an apology about how hectic everything had been. It was while looking through old photo albums last year, searching for pictures for my father's memorial service, that I discovered the letter that changed everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. Tucked between pages of Sarah's school photos and soccer team pictures, I found a handwritten note in my father's distinctive script dated just 6 months before his heart attack. The paper was cream-colored stationery from his desk, and I recognized the fountain pen ink he always preferred for important correspondence. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the way we've raised the girls," the letter began, "and I'm deeply troubled by what I see happening in our family. Emma works twice as hard as Sarah for half the recognition, and we've allowed ourselves to perpetuate a system of favoritism that I fear is damaging both our daughters, though in different ways." My hands trembled as I continued reading his careful, measured words. "Sarah's entitled, selfish nature is becoming more pronounced each year, and I worry that our constant praise for mediocre achievements is creating a young woman who believes the world owes her success without effort. Meanwhile, Emma's quiet competence and genuine accomplishments go unnoticed, and I can see her withdrawing from us emotionally. She's building walls to protect herself from our neglect, and I don't blame her." The letter went on to detail specific instances. I thought no one had noticed the way my achievements were minimized, while Sarah's were celebrated, how my opinions were dismissed while hers were treated as profound insights. How I had learned to expect disappointment so thoroughly that I stopped hoping for anything different. "I've decided to have a serious conversation with Margaret about this," the letter concluded. "We need to acknowledge what we've done and make real changes before it's too late. Emma deserves better from us, and Sarah needs to learn that the world won't continue to hand her everything simply because she exists. I plan to start by making sure Emma knows how proud I am of the remarkable young woman she's becoming." The letter was unsigned, clearly a draft he'd been working on before putting his thoughts into final form. He died of a massive heart attack 3 weeks later, taking his good intentions with him to the grave and leaving me with the bittersweet knowledge that at least one person had seen the truth, even if he'd never had the chance to act on it. That letter would become more important than I ever imagined. 18 months ago, while I was still processing the emotional weight of my father's letter, Sarah burst through the front door of our family home with the kind of excitement usually reserved for lottery winners or marriage proposals. She had just received what she described as the call that would change everything, a personal invitation from David Harrison's senior partner at Harrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious marketing firms on the East Coast. According to Sarah, Mr. Harrison had been tracking her career trajectory for months and was so impressed with her portfolio that he wanted to offer her a position as senior marketing director with a starting salary of $150,000. The family reaction was everything Sarah could have hoped for, and more. My mother immediately called every relative within a 50-mile radius to share the news, her voice practically vibrating with pride as she recounted how our Sarah had been personally selected by such an important executive. My father, still alive then and beginning to show the early signs of the heart problems that would claim him, seemed genuinely impressed by the salary figure and kept repeating how he'd always known Sarah had that special something that would take her places. Within a week, my parents had organized what they called an achievement celebration at the country club, complete with champagne toasts and a sheet cake decorated with Harrison & Associates' corporate logo. 43 people attended that party, including neighbors, family friends, and distant relatives who drove hours just to bask in Sarah's reflected glory. I watched from my usual position on the periphery as Sarah held court describing her upcoming responsibilities, managing multi-million-dollar national campaigns, and her plans to revolutionize their digital marketing strategy. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Tribune, caught wind of Sarah's success story and featured her in their monthly Rising Stars column. The article, which I still have folded in my desk drawer, painted her as a brilliant marketing innovator who had climbed the corporate ladder through pure talent and determination. The reporter quoted my mother extensively, describing how proud the family was of Sarah's natural leadership abilities and innovative thinking. The piece included a professional headshot of Sarah in a borrowed designer suit, looking every inch the successful executive she was pretending to be. Our neighbors transformed into Sarah's personal cheerleading squad virtually overnight. Mrs. Henderson from next door started introducing herself at the grocery store as the woman who lives next to the Harrison and Associates executive, while Mr. and Mrs. Chen began inviting my parents to dinner parties specifically so they could show off their connection to local business royalty. The mailman asked about Sarah's career every time he delivered packages, and even the teenager who mowed our lawn started treating our house with a kind of reverent respect, as if success were contagious and might somehow rub off on him. What none of them knew, what Sarah herself didn't know, was that David Harrison wasn't just any senior partner at a prestigious firm. He was my employee, hired 2 years earlier as the lead consultant for the marketing division of Carter Strategic Solutions, the company I had built from nothing while they all assumed I was barely scraping by. David was a brilliant marketing executive who had left his previous position at a Fortune 500 company specifically because I had offered him the creative freedom and profit-sharing arrangement that larger corporations couldn't match. He reported directly to me, and every strategic decision at Harrison and Associates, which was actually a subsidiary of my consulting firm. Though the paperwork was complex enough that casual investigation wouldn't reveal the connection, came across my desk for final approval. Sarah's recruitment hadn't been the result of David's independent talent scouting as she believed. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated 3-year plan that I had designed with the precision of a chess master thinking 20 moves ahead. I had studied Sarah's work patterns, her social media presence, her professional connections, and her psychological triggers with the thoroughness of a behavioral scientist. Every networking event she attended where she happened to meet influential people, every conference where she coincidentally encountered decision-makers, every opportunity that seemed to fall into her lap, all of it had been arranged through my extensive network of professional contacts. The position at Harrison and Associates wasn't just a job. It was an elaborate stage where Sarah would unknowingly perform the role I had written for her. Her salary, impressive though it seemed to our family, represented less than 3% of the annual revenue from just one of my client accounts. The prestigious projects she managed were real enough, but they were funded by contracts I had secured and budgets I had approved. Her corner office, her company car, her expense account, even her professional wardrobe allowance, all of it flowed from revenue streams that ultimately traced back to my business decisions. I had positioned David to approach Sarah at precisely the right moment when her previous job was becoming stagnant and her ego was hungry for validation. The recruitment process had been designed to make her feel chosen, special, uniquely talented, all the things our family had conditioned her to expect from the world. I knew she would accept the offer without investigating too deeply into the company's ownership structure or questioning why such a successful firm would be so eager to hire someone with her relatively modest track record. Watching her bask in the family's adoration, seeing our parents' faces glow with pride at their successful daughter's achievements, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. They were celebrating success that existed only because I had created it for her, praising accomplishments that she had earned only in the most technical sense. Sarah was living a carefully constructed illusion, and our family was buying into it completely. And one day, she'd learn just how much she owed me. While Sarah was basking in the glow of her fabricated success, I couldn't help but remember the brutal reality of how I had actually built my life from nothing, starting with the most humble beginnings imaginable. At 18, fresh out of high school with grades that should have earned me scholarship opportunities, I found myself working the night shift as a commercial cleaner at Riverside Office Complex, mopping floors and emptying trash cans from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The job paid $8.50 an hour, barely enough to cover community college tuition, but it was the only work I could find that would allow me to attend classes during the day. My family's reaction to my employment was swift and merciless. Sarah, then a college sophomore whose tuition and living expenses were fully funded by our parents, took particular delight in announcing to anyone who would listen that her sister was literally a janitor. During family dinners, she would regale relatives with exaggerated stories about how I came home smelling like industrial disinfectant, making gagging gestures and waving her hand in front of her nose for dramatic effect. My mother would shake her head sadly and tell neighbors that she couldn't understand why I was wasting time on education, when I clearly wasn't college material like Sarah. The physical exhaustion of working nights while attending classes during the day was nothing compared to the emotional toll of my family's constant ridicule. My father would ask pointed questions about when I planned to get a real job and stop playing around with these night shift fantasies. When I tried to explain that I was saving money for a business degree, he would laugh and tell me that college was for people who had the brains and the breeding to make something of themselves, not for someone who needed to clean offices to survive. By my sophomore year, financial pressure forced me to expand beyond just the cleaning job. I picked up weekend catering work with Elegant Events, a local company that handled weddings and corporate functions. The work was grueling 12-hour shifts on my feet, carrying heavy trays and dealing with demanding clients, but it paid $15 an hour plus tips. Simultaneously, I began offering freelance bookkeeping services to anyone who would hire me, working from the cramped desk in my childhood bedroom on my one day off each week. My business cards, printed at Kinko's for $39, looked embarrassingly amateur compared to the glossy marketing materials Sarah brought home from her internships, but they represented hope for something better. The bookkeeping clients I attracted during those early years were exactly the kind of small business owners my family looked down upon. Maria Santos hired me to manage the books for her food truck, Abuela's Kitchen, paying me $75 a month to track her daily receipts and handle quarterly tax preparations. Tommy Chen, who owned 3 hair salons in the strip malls across town, needed help organizing his employee payroll and vendor payments. Frank Rodriguez, a contractor who specialized in bathroom renovations, was drowning in invoices and receipts stuffed into shoebox filing systems. These hardworking entrepreneurs couldn't afford the big accounting firms that charged hundreds of dollars per hour, but they desperately needed someone reliable to help them organize their finances and navigate tax obligations. My family treated these clients like they were beneath acknowledgement. When Maria would occasionally call the house phone to discuss tax questions, my mother would answer with barely concealed disdain, telling me afterward that those people should learn to handle their own simple bookkeeping instead of bothering college students. Sarah made jokes about my taco truck empire and referred to my clients as Emma's charity cases, suggesting that anyone who hired me was obviously too unsuccessful to afford a real accountant. Despite working roughly 70 hours per week across 3 different jobs, I managed to save nearly every penny I earned. My lifestyle was Spartan by necessity: generic groceries, second-hand clothes, and a 15-year-old Honda Civic that I maintained myself using YouTube tutorials. Every dollar not spent on absolute necessities went into a savings account that I monitored obsessively, watching it grow from hundreds to thousands as the months passed. My family assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck, barely making ends meet and struggling to afford even basic necessities. This assumption made my occasional small splurges particularly problematic in their eyes. When I bought a new laptop for my accounting work, a modest Dell that cost $600, but was essential for managing multiple client files, Sarah announced to the dinner table that I was trying to look successful with credit card debt. When I replaced my ancient flip phone with a basic smartphone to handle business calls more professionally, my mother worried aloud about my spending addiction and suggested I might need financial counseling. A single professional blazer from the department store clearance rack became evidence that I was showing off and living beyond my means. The most painful part wasn't their lack of support for my ambitions, but their absolute certainty that I was destined to fail. They spoke about my future in terms of limitations and lowered expectations, assuming that cleaning offices and catering weddings represented the peak of my potential rather than stepping stones towards something greater. When I mentioned that my client base was growing and I was considering expanding my services, they exchanged knowing looks that said they were humoring a delusion rather than acknowledging a legitimate business plan. After 3 years of grinding through this exhausting routine, maintaining perfect grades while building a small but steady client roster, I had saved nearly $40,000 and earned my associate degree in business administration. I was ready to take the next step to transform my spare bedroom operation into something that could support me full-time, but I lacked the business connections and industry credibility to attract higher-paying clients. That opportunity arrived in the form of a man who saw what no one else did. The man who changed everything was Robert Mitchell, a seasoned entrepreneur who had built and sold 3 successful companies before his 50th birthday. He came to me initially as a potential client recommended by Frank Rodriguez after I had helped the contractor restructure his business to qualify for larger municipal contracts. Robert needed someone to handle the financial planning for his latest venture, a tech startup focused on small business management software, but what he discovered during our first meeting was something he hadn't expected to find in my cramped bedroom office. Within 6 months of working with Robert, I had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of market trends and investment opportunities that impressed him far more than my bookkeeping skills. He began asking my opinion on potential business partnerships, market entry strategies, and funding decisions. When his startup needed additional capital for expansion, I quietly invested $15,000 of my savings, a significant risk, but one that paid off spectacularly when the company was acquired 18 months later for $12 million. My small investment had grown to nearly $200,000, and Robert was so impressed with my analytical abilities that he offered me something no one in my family could have imagined: a partnership in his next venture. That partnership became the foundation for Anonymous Capital Partners, an investment firm that operated completely under the radar, funded entirely by the profits from my increasingly successful consulting business and those early startup investments. Over the following 5 years, while my family continued to view me as their perpetual disappointment, I had quietly become one of the most influential early-stage investors in the regional startup ecosystem. The firm's anonymity was both a practical necessity and a personal choice. I had learned the value of operating without the scrutiny or interference of people who had already decided what I was capable of achieving. The 12 companies in Anonymous Capital Partners' portfolio represented a carefully curated collection of businesses that I had identified as having exceptional growth potential. TechFlow Solutions, a customer relationship management platform for small businesses, had grown from a 3-person operation working out of a garage to a company with over 200 employees and annual revenues exceeding $50 million. Green Logistics, a sustainable shipping company I had funded in its earliest stages, now handled supply chain management for major retail chains across the Southeast. DataBridge Analytics, which developed predictive modeling software for healthcare providers, had been acquired by a Fortune 500 company for 8 times my initial investment. What made this success particularly satisfying was watching Sarah unknowingly build her entire professional reputation on the foundation I had created. The marketing conferences she attended so proudly, where she claimed to have developed her extensive industry network, were events that Anonymous Capital Partners sponsored annually. The influential executives she met at those conferences were often founders or senior managers of companies in my investment portfolio. People who knew me as their primary funding source, even though they had never connected my real name to my investment activities. Sarah's favorite professional story involved meeting the CEO of TechFlow Solutions at a Denver marketing summit, where she claimed to have impressed him so thoroughly with her innovative campaign strategies that he became a valuable mentor and reference for future opportunities. What she didn't know was that I had specifically arranged for that introduction through Robert Mitchell, who served on TechFlow's advisory board. The CEO had been briefed about Sarah's connection to me and instructed to treat her networking attempts favorably as a personal favor to their primary investor. Similarly, Her much-celebrated collaboration with Green Logistics on their national rebranding campaign had come about because I had suggested to their marketing director that Sarah's firm might be worth considering for smaller projects. The success of that campaign, which Sarah used as the centerpiece of her professional portfolio, was built on strategic insights that I had provided to Green Logistics months before Sarah ever heard the company's name. The most elaborate orchestration involved Databridge Analytics, whose founders I had been advising since their company's inception. When they needed a marketing consultant to help launch their new healthcare platform, I ensured that Harrison & Associates would be among the firms invited to submit proposals. Sarah spent weeks developing what she considered her most brilliant campaign strategy, never realizing that the project specifications had been written specifically to highlight her particular strengths and minimize her weaknesses. Meanwhile, my family's perception of my financial situation remained frozen in time. They still assumed I was living in the same spare bedroom, driving the same ancient Honda Civic, and struggling to make ends meet with my little bookkeeping business. When I moved into a modest downtown apartment, they assumed I was finally earning enough to afford rent. When I upgraded to a reliable used car, they worried I was taking on debt I couldn't handle. The idea that I might be accumulating actual wealth was so far outside their understanding of my capabilities that they never questioned the small improvements in my lifestyle or wondered where the money was coming from. Sarah's stories about her professional achievements became a source of private amusement during family gatherings. She would describe her breakthrough meetings with executives who were actually my business partners, her innovative collaborations with companies I had funded, and her industry insights that were often based on information I had provided through carefully orchestrated channels. The family hung on every word praising her business acumen and natural networking abilities, while I sat quietly knowing that virtually every professional success she celebrated had been made possible by investments and connections flowing from anonymous capital partners. The irony reached its peak when Sarah began working at Harrison & Associates, completely unaware that her dream job existed because I had specifically created the opportunity for her. Her salary, her projects, her professional reputation, all of it was built on a foundation that traced back to my business decisions and investment strategies. One of those contracts had her name written all over it. The contract that would finally expose the elaborate web I had woven was sitting on my desk that Wednesday afternoon, requiring nothing more than my signature to set 3 years of careful planning into motion. My real office occupied the entire 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that stretched for miles in every direction. The mahogany conference table could seat 20 people comfortably, and the private executive bathroom was larger than the spare bedroom where my family still imagined I conducted my little bookkeeping business. This was where I made the decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in annual revenue. Yet to my family, I remained the failure who cleaned offices and struggled to pay rent. David Harrison sat across from my desk reviewing the monthly payroll reports for Harrison & Associates, with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him such a valuable partner in this elaborate orchestration. The numbers were impressive by any standard 43 employees, including Sarah drawing salaries that totaled nearly $400,000 per month. Sarah's paycheck alone represented $12,500, a figure that would seem impossibly generous to someone who remembered me scraping together grocery money just a few years earlier. "Everything looks perfect," David said, sliding the signature pages across the polished surface toward me. "The direct deposits will process tonight and physical checks will be distributed tomorrow morning as usual. Your sister should receive hers around 10 a.m., assuming she follows her typical schedule of arriving at the office by 9:30. I picked up my Mont Blanc fountain pen, the same one I had used to sign every major business contract over the past 18 months, and carefully wrote my name on the designated lines. Emma Catherine Carter, President and CEO, Carter Strategic Solutions. The signature was bold and confident, nothing like the hesitant scrawl I had used during my college years when signing seemed like such an adult responsibility. Each letter was deliberate, unmistakably mine, impossible to mistake for anyone else's handwriting. The irony of the timing was almost too perfect to be coincidental. That very evening was our monthly family dinner, a tradition my mother had maintained religiously since Sarah and I were children. These gatherings had become increasingly painful over the years, as Sarah's fabricated success story grew more elaborate and my family's dismissal of my actual achievements became more entrenched. Tonight would be particularly challenging, because Sarah had been building up to some major announcement about her career advancement, hinting for weeks about big changes and exciting opportunities that she planned to reveal. As I sealed the signed documents in the interoffice envelope that would deliver them to Harrison & Associates' Human Resources Department, I found myself mentally calculating the exact timeline of tomorrow's revelation. Sarah typically checked her email first thing upon arriving at work, but payroll notifications were distributed through the internal messaging system around 10 a.m. She would probably spend her usual hour gossiping with colleagues and getting coffee before settling down to review her paycheck. The moment she opened that envelope and saw my signature at the bottom, her entire understanding of our family dynamic would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The drive to my parents' house took 45 minutes through traffic that moved with typical Wednesday evening sluggishness. I used the time to rehearse my poker face, practicing the same mild, slightly defeated expression that my family expected to see whenever Sarah dominated the conversation with her professional achievements. The challenge would be maintaining that facade while knowing that in approximately 18 hours everything would change forever. Dinner unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Sarah arrived 20 minutes late, her entrance choreographed for maximum dramatic impact, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing a smile that suggested she was barely containing earth-shattering news. My mother fussed over her appearance, complimenting her new designer handbag and asking detailed questions about her latest marketing campaigns. My father nodded approvingly as Sarah described her increasing responsibilities and growing influence within the company. "Emma," Sarah said, suddenly turning toward me with that particular gleam in her eyes that always preceded public humiliation. "Are you still doing that bookkeeping thing from your apartment? I keep hearing from people that you're not exactly thriving in the business world." The table fell silent, waiting for my response. This was familiar territory, Sarah establishing dominance by highlighting my supposed failures while positioning herself as the family success story. I had endured countless variations of this conversation over the years, each one designed to reinforce the established hierarchy that placed her achievements far above my struggles. "I'm managing," I replied quietly, using the same resigned tone that had served me well during previous family gatherings. "Nothing as impressive as what you're doing, obviously." Sarah's smile widened, clearly satisfied with my acknowledgement of her superior status. She launched into an elaborate description of her latest project, a national campaign for a major client that would revolutionize digital marketing strategies across multiple industries. The family listened with rapt attention, asking admiring questions and offering congratulations on her innovative approach. I sat through the entire performance, nodding at appropriate moments and maintaining the humble, slightly envious expression they expected to see. Inside, I was counting down the hours until Sarah would discover that her impressive career, her substantial salary, and her professional reputation were all built on a foundation that I had created specifically for her. The next morning, her paycheck landed on her desk with my signature. I didn't need to be physically present at Harrison & Associates to witness Sarah's world crumbling that Thursday morning, because David Harrison had strategically positioned himself in the break room adjacent to Sarah's cubicle area, armed with a fresh cup of coffee and a clear view of her desk. His text message arrived at exactly 10:17 a.m., containing just 4 words that filled me with a satisfaction I had been anticipating for months. "She's seen the signature." According to David's detailed report, which he delivered during our lunch meeting 3 hours later, Sarah had approached her desk that morning with her usual confident stride, greeting colleagues with the bright smile and cheerful small talk that had become her trademark since joining the company. She had settled into her ergonomic chair, logged into her computer, and begun her typical morning routine of checking emails and reviewing her calendar for the day's meetings. The payroll notification had appeared in her inbox at 10:15, marked with the standard corporate formatting that indicated direct deposit confirmation and attached paycheck details. David described how Sarah had clicked on the attachment with casual indifference, probably expecting to see the same automated signature that had appeared on her previous 8 paychecks. Instead, she found herself staring at my name written in the distinctive handwriting she had known since childhood, positioned directly below the corporate seal and official approval stamps that made the document legally binding. For nearly 30 seconds, according to David's account, she simply sat frozen, her eyes moving repeatedly from my signature to the company letterhead and back again, as if trying to process information that her brain refused to accept as reality. The physical transformation was immediate and dramatic. David watched as the color drained from Sarah's face, leaving her complexion pale and slightly gray. Her hands began trembling so violently that she had to place the printed paycheck on her desk to prevent dropping it, and her breathing became shallow and rapid, suggesting the onset of a panic attack. She looked around the office space, frantically checking to see if any of her coworkers had noticed her distress, then quickly minimized the document on her computer screen and grabbed the physical copy, clutching it against her chest, as if hiding evidence of a crime. The desperate damage control began within minutes of her initial shock. Sarah forced herself to stand up, smoothed her skirt with hands that were still visibly shaking, and walked to the water cooler where 3 of her colleagues were discussing their weekend plans. David positioned himself close enough to overhear as Sarah inserted herself into the conversation with an artificial brightness that barely concealed her inner turmoil. "Did you guys know that Emma Carter bought into the company recently?" she announced with a laugh that sounded forced and brittle. "My sister of all people. I guess she finally scraped together enough money to make some kind of investment. It's actually kind of sweet that she's trying to get involved in real business." Her colleague Jennifer looked confused and asked for clarification about what kind of investment Sarah was referring to, which sent Sarah scrambling for additional details she clearly didn't possess. She began embellishing frantically, claiming that I had probably purchased a small percentage of the company through some kind of employee stock option program, or perhaps I had inherited money that allowed me to buy into the firm as a silent partner. Each explanation sounded more desperate than the last, and David could see her coworkers exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely convinced by her increasingly elaborate story. The conversation became more uncomfortable when Jennifer mentioned that she had never heard anything about new investors or ownership changes, and that such information would typically be communicated to all employees through official company announcements. Sarah's response was to laugh even more artificially and suggest that maybe the partnership was so small that it didn't warrant company-wide notification, or perhaps the legal paperwork was still being finalized. David noted that by this point Sarah was speaking faster than usual, and her voice had risen slightly in pitch, both signs of stress that her observant colleagues were beginning to notice. Throughout the remainder of the morning, Sarah made increasingly frantic attempts to control the narrative surrounding my signature on her paycheck. She cornered David privately in his office, demanding to know the details of my involvement with the company and insisting that there must be some kind of mistake or clerical error. When David calmly explained that I was indeed the president and CEO of Carter Strategic Solutions, the parent company that owned Harrison and Associates, Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. David described watching as rage replaced confusion in Sarah's expression, her face flushing red and her jaw clenching as the full implications of her situation became clear. She realized that every achievement she had celebrated, every professional milestone she had reached, every salary increase she had received over the past 8 months had been orchestrated by the sister she had spent her entire life dismissing as a failure. The humiliation was devastating, made worse by the knowledge that I had been watching her perform this charade while knowing the truth about who held the real power. The final conversation David overheard took place later that afternoon when Sarah called our mother from her desk phone, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. She explained the signature situation in terms that painted me as a manipulative schemer who had somehow tricked my way into a position of authority, insisting that this was all part of some elaborate plot to embarrass her and damage her professional reputation. David could hear our mother's shocked responses through the phone, followed by Sarah's increasingly vehement promises that she would not allow this situation to continue. I don't care what kind of game Emma thinks she's playing, Sarah hissed into the phone, her voice carrying across the office space despite her attempts to speak quietly. She's about to learn that I'm not the same little girl she can push around anymore. This ends now. She vowed I'd regret ever humiliating her. Sarah's retaliation campaign began within 48 hours of discovering my signature on her paycheck, and it was more vicious and coordinated than I had anticipated, even from someone with her talent for manipulation. The first wave of attacks came through carefully planted whispers in our extended family network, starting with phone calls to our most gossip-prone relatives and spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. By the weekend, cousins who hadn't spoken to me in months were calling with concerned questions about rumors they had heard regarding my sudden and suspicious rise in the business world. The narrative Sarah constructed was both clever and damaging, designed to explain my success, while simultaneously undermining its legitimacy. According to her version of events, I had somehow inherited a substantial sum of money from an unnamed distant relative, but the inheritance had come with strings attached that suggested questionable origins. She implied without directly stating that this mystery money might have been connected to illegal activities, tax evasion, or other unsavory business practices that would explain how someone with my supposed lack of talent could afford to buy into established companies. Sarah's storytelling became more elaborate with each retelling, incorporating just enough specific details to sound credible while remaining vague enough to avoid outright accusations that could be disproven. She told Cousin Margaret that she had heard from reliable sources that my business involved helping clients hide assets from tax authorities. She confided to Uncle Robert that my consulting firm was rumored to specialize in creative accounting that bordered on fraudulent. She suggested to Aunt Patricia that my investment activities might be connected to money laundering schemes that used legitimate businesses as fronts for criminal enterprises. The most damaging aspect of Sarah's campaign was her recruitment of former employees from various companies in my professional network. Through methods I could only assume involved financial incentives, she managed to convince 3 people who had worked with my clients to provide fabricated testimony about my supposed incompetence and unethical behavior. Marcus Webb, a former bookkeeper at one of Frank Rodriguez's construction sites, suddenly began telling anyone who would listen that I had advised Frank to underreport income to avoid paying proper taxes. Linda Patterson, who had worked briefly at Maria Santos's food truck operation, claimed that I had encouraged Maria to pay employees under the table to avoid payroll taxes and workers' compensation requirements. Most troubling was the testimony of Jennifer Coles, a former administrative assistant at TechFlow Solutions who had been laid off during a corporate restructuring 6 months earlier. Jennifer began spreading detailed stories about witnessing me pressure company executives to manipulate financial reports and hide losses from potential investors. Her accounts were specific enough to sound credible, including references to actual meetings and real company executives, but twisted in ways that painted my legitimate business advice as criminal conspiracy. The psychological impact of these attacks was more devastating than I had expected. Even though I knew the accusations were false, hearing them repeated by family members and former business associates created a constant undercurrent of anxiety and self-doubt. I found myself second-guessing legitimate business decisions and wondering if my success really had been built on foundations that others might consider questionable. The isolation was particularly painful because the very achievements I was most proud of were being reframed as evidence of corruption and dishonesty. Sarah's campaign reached its peak during what should have been a celebration of my cousin David's engagement, when she cornered me at the family gathering and delivered what amounted to a public interrogation disguised as sisterly concern. In front of 15 relatives, she expressed worry about the rumors surrounding my business practices and suggested that perhaps I should consider seeking legal counsel to ensure that my activities were completely above board. The conversation was masterfully orchestrated to make me appear guilty regardless of how I responded, and I could see doubt creeping into the eyes of family members who had never paid much attention to my career before. The turning point came 3 weeks into Sarah's assault on my reputation when I received an unexpected phone call from Aunt Helen, my father's younger sister, who had always maintained a quiet presence at family gatherings without involving herself in the drama that seemed to follow Sarah wherever she went. Helen was 73 years old, a retired librarian who had never married and lived alone in the house where she and my father had grown up. Her voice on the phone was gentle but determined, asking if she could visit me at my apartment to discuss something important that she had been thinking about for a long time. When Aunt Helen arrived the following evening, she carried with her a large leather-bound scrapbook that looked like it belonged in a museum. The book was filled with newspaper clippings, printed emails, business cards, and handwritten notes that documented my professional journey with the meticulous attention to detail that only a librarian could provide. She had saved every mention of my name in local business publications, every client testimonial I had received, and every piece of evidence that demonstrated my legitimate success in building Carter Strategic Solutions. "I've been keeping track of your real story for almost 6 years," Helen said quietly, settling into my living room chair and opening the scrapbook to the first page. "I knew that someday the family would need to see the truth about what you've accomplished, and I wanted to make sure someone was paying attention to the facts instead of the fiction." The scrapbook revealed that Helen had been conducting her own quiet investigation into my business activities, contacting former clients to verify my work, researching my company's registration and tax records, and even speaking with other business owners who had worked with Carter Strategic Solutions. Every piece of evidence confirmed that my success was not only legitimate, but also built on a foundation of ethical business practices and genuine expertise. "Your father would be so proud of what you've built," Helen continued, her eyes bright with emotion. "And he would be heartbroken to see how Sarah is trying to destroy it with lies and jealousy. I've stayed quiet for too long watching this family treat you unfairly, but I won't stand by while she tries to ruin your reputation with these malicious rumors." But one loyal voice whispered the truth back to me. Aunt Helen's support provided a temporary shield against Sarah's character assassination campaign, but it couldn't protect me from the devastating blow that came when I decided to approach my parents directly with evidence of my legitimate business success. Armed with Helen's meticulously documented scrapbook and official financial statements from Carter Strategic Solutions, I arranged to meet them at their house on a quiet Sunday afternoon, hoping that concrete proof of my achievements might finally break through decades of ingrained prejudice and help them see the truth about both their daughters. The conversation began badly and deteriorated rapidly from there. My mother answered the door with the weary expression she reserved for dealing with what she considered my latest attempt to cause family drama, and my father barely looked up from his newspaper when I entered the living room. I spread the documents across their coffee table, methodically explaining each piece of evidence that demonstrated not only my business success, but also the legitimate ethical foundation upon which it had been built. I showed them tax returns proving millions in annual revenue, client testimonials praising my integrity and expertise, and business registration documents establishing the timeline of my company's growth. "This is all very impressive paperwork," my father said after glancing briefly at the financial statements. "But Sarah has already explained how you came into this money. And frankly, Emma, some of the things we're hearing about your business practices are deeply concerning." My mother nodded in agreement. Her lips pursed in the disapproving expression I remembered from childhood whenever I had disappointed her expectations. "Sarah told us about the rumors, honey. We know you're probably not doing anything technically illegal, but it sounds like you're operating in some very gray areas that could get you into serious trouble." The complete dismissal of evidence in favor of Sarah's fabricated narrative was breathtaking in its thoroughness. I attempted to explain that every rumor Sarah had spread was demonstrably false, pointing to specific documentation that proved my business relationships were built on transparent ethical practices. I offered to arrange meetings with my clients so they could verify the truth directly from the sources who had actually worked with me. I even suggested they speak with Robert Mitchell, whose reputation in the business community was beyond reproach and who could vouch for my integrity. "Emma, you've always been jealous of your sister's success." My mother interrupted, her voice taking on the sharp edge that had silenced my protests throughout childhood. "Ever since you were little, you've resented the fact that Sarah has natural talents and social skills that come easily to her. Now that she's achieved real success in the corporate world, you're trying to tear her down with these elaborate stories about your supposed business empire." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how completely my parents had accepted Sarah's version of reality without even considering that their assumptions about me might be wrong. My father joined the attack, suggesting that my jealousy and lies were becoming increasingly problematic for the entire family, and that I needed to grow up and accept that not everyone can be as successful as Sarah. As they continued their lecture about my character flaws and psychological problems, a specific memory surfaced that crystallized everything wrong with our family dynamic. It was my college graduation day, the culmination of 6 years of part-time education while working multiple jobs to pay tuition. I had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration, achieving the highest GPA in my class, despite the enormous challenges of balancing academic excellence with financial necessity. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, and I had sent my parents the invitation 6 weeks in advance, circling the date on their calendar and reminding them multiple times about the importance of this milestone. That Saturday morning, I received a frantic phone call from my mother explaining that they couldn't attend my graduation because Sarah was having a medical emergency that required immediate parental support. The emergency, I learned later through casual family conversation, was a severe hangover following Sarah's 21st birthday celebration, which had extended into a 3-day party marathon that left her dehydrated and nauseous. My parents spent my graduation day bringing Sarah ginger ale and soup, holding her hair while she vomited, and assuring her that her discomfort was perfectly understandable given the stress of reaching such an important milestone. I had walked across that stage alone, accepting my diploma and academic honors while scanning the audience for familiar faces that weren't there. The other graduates were surrounded by proud families, taking photographs and celebrating achievements that represented years of sacrifice and hard work. I drove home afterward to an empty apartment, hung my diploma on the wall without ceremony, and began preparing for my Monday morning shift at the catering company. The memory of that day brought clarity to my current situation with devastating precision. My parents had missed the most important academic achievement of my life to comfort Sarah through a hangover, and now they were dismissing concrete evidence of my business success to protect her fabricated reputation. The pattern was so deeply entrenched that no amount of documentation or proof would ever convince them to question their fundamental assumptions about which daughter deserved their support. "I think it's time for you to seriously consider getting some professional help," my mother concluded as I gathered my papers from their coffee table. "This obsession with competing against Sarah is unhealthy, and these elaborate fantasies about being more successful than she is suggest that you might be having some kind of psychological break from reality." As I drove away from their house that afternoon, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The desperate need for their approval, the hope that someday they might see my true worth, the belief that family love could overcome decades of favoritism, all of it finally died. I realized that my parents would never change because admitting they had been wrong about me would require acknowledging that they had failed as parents for 34 years. It was easier to dismiss my success as delusion than to confront their own responsibility for the damage they had caused. The emotional detachment that followed was both liberating and heartbreaking. I stopped caring whether they believed in my achievements or approved of my choices. But that freedom came at the cost of accepting that I would never have the family relationships I had longed for since childhood. Then I discovered just how far my sister was willing to go. The emotional detachment I had achieved from my parents' rejection provided an unexpected clarity that allowed me to focus entirely on protecting the business empire I had built through years of careful planning and ethical practices. This newfound mental freedom proved invaluable when I discovered that Sarah's campaign against my reputation was merely the opening salvo in a much more sophisticated and dangerous assault on everything I had worked to create. The revelation came through my subscription to Corporate Intelligence Weekly, a legitimate business publication that monitors competitive activities and market movements within our industry sector. The brief mention appeared in their Executive Movements section, a regular feature that tracked hiring patterns and personnel changes among major consulting firms. According to the report, Blackstone Consulting had been conducting exploratory discussions with several mid-level marketing executives from competing firms seeking candidates with specific expertise in small business development and startup consulting. The description was generic enough to apply to dozens of potential candidates. But one detail caught my attention immediately. The report mentioned that Blackstone was particularly interested in executives with insider knowledge of emerging market opportunities and established client relationships in the regional startup ecosystem. That phrase triggered every alarm bell in my business instincts because it described exactly the kind of information that Sarah had access to through her position at Harrison & Associates. More troubling was the timing of Blackstone's recruitment activities, which had begun just 2 weeks after Sarah discovered my signature on her paycheck. The coincidence was too specific to ignore, so I authorized Robert Mitchell to conduct a discreet investigation into Blackstone's recent activities and any potential connections to Harrison & Associates employees. Robert's findings, delivered 3 days later through encrypted email, confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed a level of betrayal that shocked me even after years of witnessing Sarah's capacity for manipulation. Through his network of industry contacts, Robert had learned that Sarah had initiated contact with Blackstone's senior partner Marcus Webb through a carefully orchestrated introduction at a professional networking event. The initial meeting had been disguised as a casual conversation about industry trends, but subsequent encounters had evolved into detailed discussions about Sarah's access to confidential client information and her willingness to share that intelligence in exchange for career advancement. The scope of Sarah's proposed betrayal was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness and vindictiveness. According to Robert's sources, she had offered to provide Blackstone with complete client files from Harrison & Associates, including financial data, strategic planning documents, and competitive analysis reports that my consulting firm had developed for companies in our investment portfolio. This information would allow Blackstone to undercut our proposals, steal our clients, and replicate our successful strategies without investing the time and resources required to develop original solutions. Sarah's motivation extended beyond simple financial gain, although the salary Blackstone had offered was indeed double what she currently earned at Harrison & Associates. The real prize was the opportunity to position herself as the real talent behind Carter Strategic Solutions' success, claiming credit for innovations and strategies that she had observed but never truly understood. Her plan involved feeding information to Blackstone while simultaneously undermining my reputation within the industry, suggesting that my company's achievements were actually the result of her hidden contributions and strategic insights. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's scheme was her apparent belief that she could destroy my business while emerging as the rightful heir to its success. She had convinced herself, and was attempting to convince Blackstone, that her access to my client base and strategic planning documents made her the true architect of my company's growth. In her twisted version of events, I was merely the front person who had taken credit for her behind-the-scenes brilliance, and her defection to Blackstone would expose this deception while allowing her to finally receive the recognition she deserved. Robert's investigation revealed that Sarah had already provided Blackstone with preliminary information about 3 of my most valuable clients, including financial projections and expansion plans that were supposed to be protected by multiple layers of confidentiality agreements. She had photographed documents with her personal phone during late-night hours at the Harrison & Associates office, bypassing security protocols that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of corporate espionage. The intelligence she had shared was already being used by Blackstone to prepare competitive proposals that would directly challenge contracts I had spent months negotiating. The betrayal was particularly painful because it represented a complete abandonment of any pretense of family loyalty or basic human decency. Sarah wasn't just attacking my business success. She was attempting to destroy the livelihoods of my employees and the futures of clients who had trusted me with their most sensitive strategic information. Her actions would damage innocent people who had never been involved in our family conflict, collateral victims of her obsessive need to prove her superiority over the sister she had spent a lifetime dismissing. As I reviewed the evidence Robert had gathered, I felt a cold fury building that was unlike anything I had experienced during Sarah's previous attacks on my character and reputation. Those assaults had been painful, but ultimately ineffective against someone who knew the truth about their own integrity and achievements. This corporate espionage represented a different category of threat, entirely one that could cause real financial damage to my company and potentially destroy the careers of people I cared about. The irony of Sarah's scheme was that her access to my confidential information existed only because I had created the position she now occupied at Harrison & Associates. She was using the success I had orchestrated for her as a weapon to destroy the foundation that had made that success possible. The circular logic of her betrayal would have been almost amusing if the potential consequences weren't so serious. But she forgot one thing: I always read the fine print. The discovery of Sarah's corporate espionage had taught me that playing defense would never be sufficient to protect my business or expose the full extent of her betrayal. So I had made the strategic decision 3 months earlier to implement a comprehensive counterintelligence operation designed to document her activities with the kind of evidence that would hold up in both civil and criminal court proceedings. The centerpiece of this operation was Rebecca Martinez, a licensed private investigator with 15 years of experience in corporate security and a remarkable talent for establishing trust with subjects who had no idea they were being monitored. Rebecca's credentials were impeccable, including a master's degree in criminal justice, specialized training in digital forensics, and a client list that included Fortune 500 companies dealing with internal theft and corporate espionage cases. More importantly, for my purposes, Rebecca possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into social situations and extract information from people who believed they were confiding in a trusted friend, rather than providing evidence to a professional investigator. Her background included undercover work with law enforcement, and she understood the legal requirements for gathering admissible evidence while operating within the boundaries of state and federal privacy laws. The operation began when Rebecca reached out to Sarah through Facebook, using a carefully constructed backstory that positioned her as my concerned college roommate who had heard about family tensions through mutual acquaintances and wanted to offer emotional support during what seemed like a difficult period. Rebecca's social media profile had been meticulously crafted to support this narrative, including photographs from our supposed college years together, shared memories of campus events that Rebecca had researched thoroughly, and references to professors and courses that established credibility for anyone who might investigate her claims. Sarah's response to Rebecca's overture was immediate and enthusiastic, suggesting that she was desperate for someone who would listen to her version of events without questioning her narrative or offering unwanted advice. Their first meeting took place at an upscale wine bar in downtown, where Rebecca presented herself as a successful marketing consultant who understood the pressures of corporate competition and family dynamics. Sarah spent 3 hours detailing her grievances against me, describing what she characterized as my sudden and suspicious rise in the business world and outlining her theories about how I had managed to achieve success through questionable means. Rebecca's training allowed her to guide these conversations with subtle questions that encouraged Sarah to reveal increasingly specific details about her plans for revenge and her relationship with Blackstone Consulting. The private investigator never directly asked for confidential information, instead expressing supportive interest in Sarah's career advancement and sympathetic outrage about the unfair treatment she was receiving from family members who didn't appreciate her talents. This approach made Sarah feel understood and validated, creating the emotional environment where she would voluntarily share information that she should have kept confidential. The breakthrough came during their 4th meeting when Sarah arrived at the restaurant visibly agitated and eager to share what she described as exciting developments in her plan to finally show Emma who the real success story is in our family. Rebecca activated the digital recording device concealed in her purse, a sophisticated piece of equipment that captured high-quality audio while appearing to be nothing more than a standard smartphone accessory. The conversation that followed exceeded even my expectations for useful evidence as Sarah laid out her entire conspiracy with Blackstone in exhaustive detail. Sarah began by describing her initial contact with Marcus Webb and the strategic value of the information she could provide about my client base and business operations. She explained how she had been photographing confidential documents during after-hours access to the Harrison and Associates office using her administrative credentials to bypass security protocols that were designed to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive materials. She detailed the specific client files she had already shared with Blackstone, including financial projections for TechFlow Solutions and expansion plans for Green Logistics that were supposed to be protected by multiple layers of confidentiality agreements. Most damaging to Sarah's legal position was her detailed explanation of the compensation structure she had negotiated with Blackstone, which included not only the doubled salary for her eventual employment, but also substantial cash payments for each piece of valuable intelligence she provided during the transition period. She described these payments as consulting fees, but acknowledged that they were actually rewards for corporate espionage that could result in millions of dollars in lost revenue for my company and the clients whose trust she was betraying. Rebecca's professional expertise became evident in the way she encouraged Sarah to elaborate on the most legally problematic aspects of her scheme without appearing to be fishing for specific information. When Sarah mentioned that she had concerns about the legality of her document photography, Rebecca responded with supportive reassurances that helped Sarah rationalize her actions, while simultaneously encouraging her to provide more detailed descriptions of exactly how she was circumventing security measures and confidentiality agreements. The conversation concluded with Sarah expressing confidence that her plan would not only destroy my business reputation, but also position her as the legitimate heir to whatever success I had achieved through luck and questionable connections. She believed that Blackstone would eventually offer her a partnership position that would allow her to claim credit for innovations and strategies that she had observed but never actually developed. Her delusion was so complete that she seemed genuinely convinced that she was the victim in this situation, finally taking action to claim recognition that had been unfairly denied to her. Rebecca's final report delivered to my office the following morning included not only the complete audio recording of Sarah's confession, but also photographic evidence of documents that Sarah had shown her during their conversation, including email exchanges with Blackstone representatives and copies of the confidential files she had already shared. The private investigator had also documented Sarah's after-hours access to the Harrison and Associates office, using surveillance equipment to capture images of her photographing documents that clearly showed the scope and systematic nature of her corporate espionage. One recorded conversation revealed everything I needed to know. Armed with Rebecca's recorded evidence and photographic documentation of Sarah's corporate espionage, I immediately contacted Patricia Worthington, the most formidable corporate attorney in the state, and a woman whose reputation for dismantling white-collar criminals was legendary among business circles. Patricia had built her career prosecuting cases involving corporate theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit fraud-winning settlements that had bankrupted executives who thought they were untouchable. Her retainer fee was substantial, but her track record of success made her worth every penny, especially when dealing with someone as cunning and vindictive as Sarah had proven herself to be. Our first meeting took place in Patricia's downtown law office, a marble and mahogany fortress that projected the kind of intimidating authority that made opposing counsel reconsider their strategies before entering the conference room. Patricia reviewed Rebecca's evidence with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining X-rays, making notes in her distinctive red ink, and occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and legal jurisdictions. After 3 hours of analysis, she looked up from the documents with the satisfied expression of a predator who had just identified particularly vulnerable prey. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of corporate espionage I've encountered in 20 years of practice," Patricia said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a case involving this level of documented evidence. "Your sister has violated approximately 14 different state and federal laws, including theft of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The recorded confession alone would be sufficient for criminal prosecution, but the supporting documentation makes this an absolutely bulletproof case." Patricia's legal strategy was as sophisticated as it was devastating, designed to not only protect my business interests, but also to ensure that Sarah would face both civil and criminal consequences for her actions. We began by establishing a comprehensive evidence preservation protocol that would prevent any possibility of document destruction or witness intimidation. Every piece of Rebecca's surveillance data was duplicated and stored in multiple secure locations, while time-stamped copies were filed with the court under seal to establish an unbreakable chain of custody. The next phase of our plan involved what Patricia described as controlled evidence multiplication, a technique designed to provide Sarah with additional opportunities to incriminate herself while simultaneously protecting my legitimate business operations from further damage. We created 3 entirely fictional client files complete with detailed financial projections, strategic planning documents, and expansion proposals that appeared valuable enough to attract Sarah's attention but contained enough unique identifying information to trace their theft precisely. The first honeypot file involved a fabricated renewable energy startup called SolarBridge Technologies, supposedly seeking $20 million in Series B funding for a revolutionary battery storage system. The financial projections were impressive enough to make Blackstone believe they had discovered a goldmine of investment intelligence, but every technical specification was subtly impossible, ensuring that any business plan based on this information would eventually collapse under scrutiny. More importantly, the document contained 7 specific data points that appeared nowhere else in my files, creating a forensic fingerprint that would prove definitively when Sarah stole and shared this information. The second fictional client was MedConnect Solutions, a healthcare technology company supposedly developing artificial intelligence software for medical diagnosis. This file contained elaborate market research data and competitive analysis reports that would be enormously valuable to any consulting firm working in the healthcare sector. However, the market data was carefully constructed to lead competitors toward strategies that would fail catastrophically, while the embedded tracking information would allow us to monitor exactly how and when this intelligence was being used against us. The third honeypot targeted Sarah's specific areas of expertise with Retail Genius Analytics, a marketing automation platform supposedly revolutionizing customer engagement for major retail chains. The strategic planning documents appeared to contain breakthrough insights into consumer behavior and digital marketing trends, but actually represented theories that had been thoroughly debunked by legitimate research. Any marketing campaigns based on this false intelligence would not only fail, but would also damage the reputation of whatever consulting firm had recommended these strategies. While Patricia was building our legal fortress, and I was laying traps for Sarah's continued espionage, I simultaneously began the complex process of moving my legitimate assets and valuable client relationships beyond her reach. This involved creating a network of subsidiary companies with deliberately obscured ownership structures, transferring contracts and intellectual property through legitimate business transactions that would be impossible for Sarah or Blackstone to penetrate or replicate. The most valuable clients in my portfolio were quietly approached about consolidating their consulting relationships under newly formed entities that offered enhanced services and better protection for their confidential information. TechFlow Solutions enthusiastically agreed to transfer their account to Meridian Strategic Partners, especially after I explained that recent security concerns required additional safeguards for their proprietary data. Green Logistics was similarly eager to work with Apex Consulting Group when presented with expanded service offerings that included international market analysis and regulatory compliance support. These moves were executed with the kind of meticulous planning that characterized all my business operations, ensuring that every transfer was properly documented, legally sound, and strategically advantageous for both my company and my clients. Sarah's access to Harrison & Associates files would soon become worthless because the most valuable information would no longer exist in locations where she could steal it, while the false intelligence I was feeding her would lead Blackstone toward increasingly expensive mistakes. The transformation from reactive victim to strategic mastermind was both liberating and grimly satisfying as I realized that Sarah's attacks on my character and business had actually provided me with the motivation and legal justification to eliminate her as a threat permanently. She had escalated our conflict beyond the realm of family drama into serious criminal activity, and Patricia's expertise would ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for crossing that line. The first crack in her empire was about to appear. The first visible signs of Sarah's deteriorating composure emerged during what should have been her moment of professional triumph, a quarterly presentation to Harrison and Associates' most important client, Pinnacle Healthcare Systems, whose annual consulting contract represented nearly 30% of the firm's total revenue. David Harrison had been feeding me detailed reports about Sarah's behavior in the weeks leading up to this presentation, noting increased irritability, frequent mistakes in routine tasks, and an unusual tendency to second-guess decisions that she would normally make confidently. The stress of maintaining her corporate espionage activities while projecting an image of professional competence was clearly taking a toll that she was struggling to conceal. According to David's account of the presentation, which took place in Pinnacle's boardroom, before 8 senior executives, including their CEO and Chief Marketing Officer Sarah, arrived 20 minutes late with an excuse about unexpected family obligations that immediately put her at a disadvantage with clients who valued punctuality above almost every other professional virtue. Her usual polished appearance showed subtle signs of strain, slightly wrinkled clothing that suggested hasty preparation makeup that didn't quite conceal the dark circles under her eyes, and a nervous energy that manifested in rapid speech and excessive hand gestures. The presentation itself was a disaster of overconfidence and poor judgment that revealed how completely Sarah had misunderstood both her clients' needs and her own capabilities. She had apparently decided to incorporate strategies based on the fictional MedConnect Solutions file I had created as bait, presenting artificial intelligence marketing concepts that sounded impressive but were fundamentally incompatible with Pinnacle's existing technology infrastructure and regulatory requirements. Her recommendation to implement predictive patient engagement algorithms demonstrated a complete lack of understanding about healthcare privacy laws, while her proposed dynamic demographic targeting system would have violated federal regulations governing medical marketing. More damaging than her technical errors was Sarah's aggressive dismissal of legitimate concerns raised by Pinnacle's executives who attempted to ask clarifying questions about implementation costs and regulatory compliance. Instead of acknowledging the validity of their concerns or offering to research solutions, Sarah became defensive and increasingly condescending, suggesting that their hesitation reflected a lack of vision rather than prudent caution. She interrupted the CEO twice and actually laughed at the Chief Marketing Officer's suggestion that some of her proposals might need legal review before implementation. David watched from the back of the room as Pinnacle's executives exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances, their expressions shifting from polite attention to obvious concern about the competence of the consultant they were paying substantial fees to advise them. The presentation concluded with an awkward silence that stretched for nearly 30 seconds before the CEO diplomatically suggested that Harrison and Associates should perhaps conduct additional research before their next meeting. Sarah interpreted this as enthusiasm for her innovative approach and spent another 10 minutes elaborating on strategies that would have landed Pinnacle in regulatory hot water within weeks of implementation. The aftermath of the presentation was swift and devastating for Sarah's reputation within the firm. David received calls from 3 different Pinnacle executives expressing serious concerns about Sarah's judgment and questioning whether Harrison and Associates was still the right consulting partner for their organization. The Chief Marketing Officer specifically mentioned that Sarah's recommendations seemed disconnected from industry realities and suggested that perhaps she needed additional training in healthcare marketing regulations before handling such sensitive accounts. Within the Harrison and Associates office, Sarah's coworkers began engaging in the kind of whispered conversations that signal a fundamental shift in professional dynamics. Jennifer Walsh, the senior account manager who had worked with Sarah on several successful projects, confided to David that she was concerned about Sarah's recent erratic behavior and wondered if personal stress might be affecting her professional performance. Michael Torres, the firm's research director, mentioned that Sarah had been asking unusual questions about client confidentiality protocols and seemed unusually interested in accessing files for accounts that weren't directly related to her assigned projects. The psychological pressure of maintaining her double life was becoming increasingly evident in Sarah's interactions with our extended family, where her behavior toward me had shifted from casual dismissiveness to barely controlled hostility that was beginning to make relatives uncomfortable. During our cousin Jennifer's baby shower, Sarah made several pointed comments about my mysterious business success that were sharp enough to create awkward silences among family members who had never witnessed such open antagonism between us. Aunt Margaret later asked my mother privately whether everything was okay between the girls, noting that Sarah seemed unusually tense and aggressive. The most telling incident occurred during our monthly family dinner, when Sarah arrived visibly agitated and spent the entire evening making increasingly bitter references to people who pretend to be successful when everyone knows they're frauds. Her comments were clearly directed at me, but delivered with enough venom that our teenage cousin David actually looked uncomfortable and changed the subject twice. Even my mother, who typically encouraged Sarah's criticism of my life choices, seemed taken aback by the intensity of her daughter's anger, and suggested that perhaps we should try to keep things pleasant during family time. Sarah's inability to compartmentalize her rage was creating cracks in the carefully constructed facade she had maintained throughout her adult life, revealing glimpses of the vindictive, obsessive personality that had always lurked beneath her charming exterior. The family members who had spent years admiring her success and social skills were beginning to see a different side of their golden child, one that was petty, mean-spirited, and increasingly unstable under pressure. David's reports indicated that Sarah was also making fundamental errors in her espionage activities, becoming careless about covering her tracks, and failing to maintain the professional demeanor that had initially made her valuable to Blackstone Consulting. She had begun taking unnecessary risks accessing files during normal business hours when other employees might notice, and asking direct questions about client information that raised red flags among the more observant members of the Harrison and Associates staff. And then she made a mistake too big to hide. The mistake that Sarah could no longer hide came in the form of her 24-year-old daughter Jessica's wedding, an elaborate celebration at St. Catherine's Episcopal Church that represented everything Sarah valued about projecting success and social status to the community that had watched her rise to prominence. Jessica had fallen in love with Thomas Richardson, the son of a prominent local family whose wedding guest list included city council members, successful business owners, and several executives from major regional corporations who had worked with Harrison and Associates over the years. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of elegant coordination featuring imported flowers, a string quartet, and reception arrangements that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Sarah had positioned herself as the mother of the bride, whose own professional success made this lavish celebration possible, frequently mentioning to guests how her executive salary and business connections had enabled her to give Jessica the wedding of her dreams. She wore a custom-designed Mother of the Bride dress that had been featured in the local society magazine, and she moved through the pre-ceremony reception with the confidence of someone who believed her carefully constructed reputation was unassailable. The guest list of nearly 200 people included not only family and friends, but also colleagues from Harrison and Associates, clients from her professional network, and business leaders, who represented the social circle she had worked so hard to penetrate. When the reception master of ceremonies announced that the bride's aunt would be offering a toast on behalf of the extended family, I rose from my assigned table near the back of the room, carrying the champagne flute that would serve as my prop for what I had planned as a carefully orchestrated moment of truth. My speech had been written and rehearsed with the precision of a legal brief, designed to sound like heartfelt family sentiment, while systematically exposing the inconsistencies in Sarah's professional narrative. The audience settled into expectant silence, many of them curious about the sister Sarah had mentioned so dismissively over the years. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice carrying clearly across the elegant ballroom thanks to the wireless microphone the wedding planner had provided. I'm Emma Carter, Sarah's younger sister, and I've had the privilege of watching Jessica grow from a beautiful little girl into the radiant bride we're celebrating tonight. But I also want to take a moment to honor Sarah herself, whose remarkable journey to success has been such an inspiration to our entire family. The opening drew warm smiles and approving nods from guests who assumed they were about to hear a standard family tribute filled with touching memories and sisterly admiration. Sarah beamed from the head table, clearly pleased to be receiving public recognition for her achievements in front of such an influential audience. She raised her own champagne glass in acknowledgement, completely unaware that I was about to systematically dismantle the professional reputation she had spent years constructing. I remember when Sarah first told us about her amazing opportunity at Harrison & Associates. I continued my tone, remaining warm and celebratory while my words began to plant seeds of doubt. She was so excited about this prestigious marketing position, and we were all curious about how she had managed to afford that incredible promotion celebration party she threw just weeks after starting there. I mean, how did you manage to organize such an expensive event when your salary was still being processed through the new employee paperwork? The question seemed innocent enough on the surface, phrased as loving family curiosity rather than pointed interrogation. But several business-savvy guests began to look puzzled as they processed the implications. Promotion celebrations typically happened after salary increases had been established and processed, not during the first weeks of employment when new hires were still completing orientation and probationary periods. And then there was that amazing business trip to Chicago that Sarah described so eloquently to our family. I continued maintaining the same affectionate tone while systematically undermining Sarah's credibility. The one where she supposedly secured that major client partnership single-handedly. I was always impressed by how a marketing director could negotiate such complex contract terms without involving the legal department or senior partners. Sarah, you never did explain how you managed to bypass all those corporate approval processes that usually take months to complete. By this point, the audience's expressions had shifted from polite attention to genuine confusion, with several guests exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to recognize serious problems with Sarah's version of events. The business executives in attendance understood corporate hierarchies well enough to know that new marketing directors don't negotiate major partnerships independently, and the timeline I was describing didn't align with standard business practices. Sarah's face had gone completely pale, and I could see her hands trembling as she realized that I was systematically exposing the fabrications she had used to build her professional reputation. Jessica looked mortified as she began to understand that her wedding reception was becoming the venue for a devastating revelation about her mother's dishonesty, while Thomas's family members sat in uncomfortable silence as they processed information that called into question everything they thought they knew about their new in-laws. Most of all, I concluded, raising my champagne glass for the traditional toast. I want to celebrate Sarah's incredible ability to make the most of every opportunity that comes her way, even when those opportunities exist, because someone else created them specifically for her benefit. To Sarah, Jessica, and Thomas, may your futures be built on foundations as solid as the truth. The toast was met with scattered, confused applause from guests who weren't quite sure what they had just witnessed, but understood that something significant had occurred. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the awkward shuffling of chairs and whispered conversations, as 200 influential community members began to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Sarah's professional achievements. But humiliation only made her more dangerous. The public humiliation at Jessica's wedding reception had wounded Sarah more deeply than I had anticipated, and her retaliation was swift, vicious, and far more sophisticated than her previous attempts to undermine my reputation. Within 72 hours of the wedding disaster, she had hired Kenneth Mallory, a private investigator, whose advertisements in the Yellow Pages promised to uncover the truth that others want to hide, and whose client testimonials boasted about his ability to find compromising information on anyone regardless of how carefully they had covered their tracks. Unlike Rebecca Martinez, who operated within strict legal and ethical boundaries, Mallory specialized in the kind of aggressive investigation techniques that bordered on harassment and occasionally crossed into illegal territory. Mallory's initial report, which Sarah leaked selectively to family members over the following weeks, focused on what he characterized as suspicious financial patterns in my early business development that suggested possible involvement in money laundering, tax evasion, or other criminal enterprises. He had constructed a narrative around my rapid transition from night shift cleaning jobs to successful business ownership, arguing that such dramatic financial improvement was impossible without external funding from questionable sources. His report highlighted the fact that I had maintained multiple bank accounts during my struggling years, characterizing this normal financial practice as evidence of deliberate obfuscation designed to hide illegal income. The most damaging aspect of Mallory's investigation was his reinterpretation of legitimate business relationships as evidence of criminal conspiracy. He had tracked down several of my earliest clients, including Maria Santos and Tommy Chen, and through leading questions and implied threats had convinced them to provide statements that painted my services in the most suspicious possible light. Maria's innocent comment that I had helped her organize her books to minimize tax obligations became evidence that I had advised illegal tax evasion schemes. Tommy's mention that I had suggested certain business expenses could be legitimately deducted became proof that I had promoted fraudulent accounting practices. Sarah weaponized Mallory's report with the strategic precision of someone who understood exactly how to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about her motivations. She began by approaching family members individually, expressing genuine concern about disturbing information she had recently discovered regarding my business practices. Her conversations were masterfully crafted to sound like reluctant revelations from a worried sister rather than malicious attacks from a vindictive enemy. During a private lunch with our cousin Margaret, Sarah tearfully explained that she had felt compelled to investigate my background after my strange behavior at Jessica's wedding, and had been horrified to discover evidence suggesting that my success might be built on criminal activity. She showed Margaret selected excerpts from Mallory's report focusing on the most damaging allegations while omitting any context that might explain the legitimate nature of my business relationships. Margaret's shocked reaction encouraged Sarah to share similar concerns with other family members, each conversation designed to plant seeds of doubt about my integrity and character. The campaign's effectiveness was amplified by Sarah's decision to target family members who had limited understanding of business practices and would be unable to distinguish between legitimate entrepreneurial activities and actual criminal behavior. Aunt Patricia, who had worked as an elementary school teacher for 40 years, was easily convinced that my rapid business growth was inherently suspicious and probably illegal. Uncle James, whose only business experience involved managing a small hardware store, found Sarah's explanations about complex financial arrangements completely believable and deeply concerning. Within 2 weeks of launching her character assassination campaign, Sarah had successfully convinced a significant portion of our extended family that I was involved in criminal enterprises that threatened to bring scandal and legal trouble to everyone associated with me. The family members who had grudgingly begun to acknowledge my professional success after years of dismissing my achievements now viewed that success as evidence of moral corruption rather than entrepreneurial talent. Holiday gatherings became exercises in uncomfortable avoidance, with relatives who had once treated me with indifference now regarding me with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The psychological impact of defending against these attacks while simultaneously protecting my legitimate business interests was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every client relationship required careful documentation to prove its legitimacy. Every financial transaction needed additional verification to demonstrate its legal foundation, and every business decision had to be evaluated not only for its strategic value, but also for its potential to be misinterpreted by hostile investigators. The constant vigilance required to maintain my professional reputation while under systematic attack consumed enormous amounts of time and mental energy that should have been devoted to growing my business. Sarah's strategy became even more sophisticated when she began spreading her accusations beyond the family circle, contacting business associates and professional contacts with anonymous tips about my supposed criminal activities. Several clients received mysterious phone calls suggesting that they should investigate their consultant's background more thoroughly, while potential business partners were warned about entering into relationships with someone whose success might be connected to illegal enterprises. The anonymous nature of these communications made them impossible to trace directly to Sarah, but the timing and specific details made her involvement obvious to anyone who understood the broader pattern of her attacks. The most insidious aspect of Sarah's campaign was her ability to turn my past struggles into evidence against me, reframing the very hardships that had motivated my success as proof of criminal intent. The multiple jobs that had demonstrated my work ethic became evidence of suspicious income sources. The careful financial planning that had enabled my business growth became proof of money laundering schemes, and the diverse client base that had provided my entrepreneurial foundation became a criminal network designed to hide illegal activities. As I watched family relationships deteriorate and business opportunities disappear due to Sarah's systematic character assassination, I realized that defending myself reactively would never be sufficient to overcome the damage she was causing. Her investigation had been thorough enough to create a compelling narrative for people who wanted to believe the worst about my success, and her strategic distribution of damaging information had poisoned too many important relationships to repair through simple denials or explanations. She thought my past would destroy me, but she had no idea how I'd use it. The decision to transform Sarah's character assassination campaign into the foundation for my ultimate victory required a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond simple retaliation. And it began with the announcement that would reshape the entire regional business landscape while positioning me as the most powerful decision-maker in our industry sector. The Horizon Development Project had been 18 months in the planning, a massive public-private partnership involving municipal governments, federal funding agencies, and private investors that would revolutionize infrastructure development across 3 states. The project's scope was unprecedented, encompassing smart city technology implementation, sustainable energy systems, and digital transformation initiatives that would generate $50 million in consulting contracts over the next 3 years. My role as the primary coordinator and contract administrator for Horizon Development had been carefully negotiated through my relationships with Robert Mitchell and the network of business leaders who comprised Anonymous Capital Partners Advisory Board. The project required someone with my unique combination of startup investment experience, municipal consulting expertise, and established relationships with both public sector administrators and private technology companies. More importantly, it required someone who could be trusted to manage enormous financial resources with absolute integrity, a reputation I had spent years building through ethical business practices and transparent financial management. The public announcement took place during the quarterly Regional Business Development Conference, where over 300 industry leaders gathered to discuss emerging opportunities and partnership prospects. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address about innovative funding models for infrastructure projects, a topic that positioned me as a thought leader, while providing the perfect platform to reveal the Horizon Development opportunity. The conference attendees included executives from every major consulting firm in the region, including several representatives from Harrison & Associates, who had no idea that their company's future was about to be placed entirely in my hands. Ladies and gentlemen, I began addressing the packed auditorium from behind the professional podium that elevated me both literally and figuratively above the audience of my peers. I'm here today to announce the most significant economic development opportunity our region has seen in over 2 decades. The Horizon Development Project represents a collaborative investment of federal infrastructure funds, state economic development resources, and private sector expertise that will transform how we approach urban planning, energy management, and technological integration across 3 state boundaries. The response was immediate and electric, with audience members leaning forward in their seats and furiously taking notes as I outlined the project's scope and potential impact. I explained how Horizon Development would require specialized consulting services in areas ranging from regulatory compliance and environmental impact assessment to marketing strategy and public relations management. The consulting contracts alone would represent more revenue than most firms generated in 5 years of normal operations, making selection as a Horizon development partner the difference between thriving and merely surviving in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The project will require 3 primary consulting partners. I continued allowing the weight of that limitation to settle over an audience that included representatives from at least 15 firms that would be eager to compete for these contracts. We'll be selecting 1 firm for regulatory and compliance consulting, 1 for technological implementation and systems integration, and 1 for marketing strategy and public engagement. The selection process will be rigorous, focusing not only on technical competence, but also on demonstrated integrity, established track records, and compatibility with Horizon Development's collaborative approach. From my elevated position, I could see David Harrison sitting in the 3rd row, his expression shifting from professional interest to dawning realization as he understood the implications of what I was announcing. Next to him sat Jennifer Walsh from Harrison & Associates, frantically scribbling notes about application deadlines and qualification requirements. Neither of them yet understood that their company's survival depended entirely on my approval, but that revelation would come soon enough. The most delicious aspect of this strategic reversal was that Harrison & Associates was uniquely positioned to compete for the marketing and public engagement contract, which represented nearly $18 million in revenue over the 3-year project timeline. Their client portfolio included exactly the kind of municipal and technology sector experience that Horizon Development required, and their recent work with healthcare systems and sustainable energy companies made them obvious candidates for consideration. Under normal circumstances, they would be strong contenders for selection as the primary marketing partner. However, these were not normal circumstances, and I was not merely another project coordinator hoping to identify qualified vendors. I was the person who would make the final selection decision, armed with complete authority to choose partners based on my assessment of their capabilities, reliability, and strategic value to the project's success. The application process would be transparent and professional, but the ultimate choice would rest entirely with someone who had very specific knowledge about Harrison & Associates' internal operations and the character of their key personnel. The questions from the audience following my presentation revealed the intensity of interest this announcement had generated throughout the regional business community. Representatives from major consulting firms asked detailed questions about application procedures, evaluation criteria, and timeline expectations. Several executives approached me privately after the formal session concluded, expressing their company's enthusiasm for participating in what they recognized as a career-defining opportunity. David Harrison was among those who requested a private conversation, his professional demeanor masking what I knew must be considerable anxiety about his firm's prospects for selection. "Emma," he said, using my first name with the familiarity of someone who believed we had a positive working relationship. "This sounds like an incredible opportunity, and I think Harrison & Associates could bring tremendous value to the marketing and public engagement component. I'd love to schedule a meeting to discuss how we might align our capabilities with your project requirements." "I'd be happy to meet with you, David," I replied with the gracious professionalism that had become my trademark in business settings. "Harrison & Associates certainly has relevant experience, and I always appreciate the opportunity to learn more about potential partners' capabilities and approach to collaborative projects. Why don't you have your team prepare a preliminary proposal outline, and we can schedule a presentation meeting once you've had time to review the full project specifications?" The power dynamic that had governed our relationship for the past year had completely reversed in the space of a single announcement, transforming me from Sarah's secret employer into the person whose approval could save or destroy her company's financial future. She would soon learn that her corporate espionage activities and character assassination campaign had been conducted against someone who now held the keys to everything she had claimed to value about professional success. And yet my revenge had only just begun. The opportunity to engineer Sarah's complete downfall through her own greed and desperation required me to project exactly the kind of vulnerability that would trigger her predatory instincts while concealing the sophisticated trap I was constructing around her predictable character flaws. Within a week of announcing the Horizon Development Project, I began implementing a carefully orchestrated campaign of false signals designed to convince Sarah that my business empire was far more fragile than it appeared, and that the massive government contract represented my last chance to avoid financial collapse, rather than the crown jewel of an already successful enterprise. The deception began with strategically leaked financial documents that painted Carter Strategic Solutions as a company struggling with cash flow problems and mounting operational expenses that threatened to overwhelm our revenue streams. These fabricated reports, which I ensured would find their way to Sarah through Rebecca Martinez's continued undercover relationship, suggested that my recent business expansion had been financed through dangerous levels of debt, and that several major clients were considering terminating their contracts due to service quality concerns that I was desperately trying to address. The false documentation was sophisticated enough to withstand casual scrutiny, while containing enough alarming details to convince someone like Sarah that immediate action could yield enormous rewards. The fake financial statements showed declining profit margins over the past 6 months, with particular emphasis on increased payroll expenses that suggested I had hired too many employees too quickly and was now struggling to meet monthly salary obligations. More enticingly, the documents implied that my ownership of Harrison & Associates was secured through loan agreements that would trigger immediate foreclosure if Carter Strategic Solutions defaulted on its debt payments. To make this financial vulnerability seem credible, I began displaying subtle signs of stress and overwork that would be noticeable to someone who was actively monitoring my behavior for signs of weakness. I started arriving at business meetings slightly late with the kind of harried appearance that suggested someone juggling too many responsibilities. I allowed my usual meticulous attention to professional dress standards to slip just enough to suggest financial pressure wearing the same outfit to multiple public events and carrying a briefcase that looked slightly worn rather than pristine. The most crucial element of the deception involved creating the impression that the Horizon Development Project represented my company's salvation, rather than its natural evolution, suggesting that landing this contract was the difference between business survival and catastrophic failure. During conversations with industry contacts that I knew would be reported back to Sarah, I expressed carefully calibrated concerns about the competitive bidding process and my company's ability to demonstrate the financial stability that government contractors typically required. "I'm honestly not sure we can compete with the bigger firms on this one," I confided to David Harrison during what appeared to be a moment of unguarded honesty. "The bonding requirements alone are going to be challenging given our current cash position, and if we don't land this contract, I'm not sure how we're going to meet our obligations to existing clients and employees." And these conversations were designed to plant the idea that Carter Strategic Solutions was financially overextended, and that my control over the Horizon Development Project represented a conflict of interest that could be exploited by someone clever enough to identify the right pressure points. The implication was that I had maneuvered myself into a position where I would be forced to award the contract to my own company, regardless of merit, creating vulnerability to competitors who could expose this impropriety to the government oversight agencies that monitored such contracts. Sarah's response to these signals was exactly what I had anticipated, based on 3 decades of observing her psychological patterns and motivational triggers. She began reaching out to contacts at Blackstone Consulting with increasing urgency, suggesting that they needed to accelerate their timeline for hiring her and implementing the intelligence she had gathered about my business operations. Her conversations with Rebecca revealed growing excitement about what she perceived as my impending downfall, and her opportunity to position herself as the legitimate alternative to my supposedly corrupt business practices. The trap's effectiveness relied on Sarah's fundamental inability to conceive that I might be more intelligent or strategic than she had always assumed, a blind spot that had prevented her from recognizing the sophisticated planning behind every aspect of our conflict. Her lifelong belief that I was the less capable sister made it impossible for her to consider that my apparent vulnerability might be carefully constructed bait rather than genuine weakness. She saw only the immediate opportunity to destroy me professionally, while claiming credit for exposing corruption that would make her a hero to government oversight agencies. More importantly, Sarah's impatience and sense of entitlement made her incapable of the careful investigation that might have revealed the deception I was constructing around her. She wanted immediate gratification and public vindication so desperately that she was willing to take enormous risks based on incomplete information and assumptions that confirmed her existing prejudices about my incompetence and moral shortcomings. The final element of the trap involved creating documentation that would appear to show improper coordination between Carter Strategic Solutions and the Horizon Development Project Selection Committee, suggesting that I was using my administrative role to guarantee my own company's selection regardless of merit. These false papers, which I ensured Sarah would discover through her continued espionage activities, painted me as someone who had engineered an elaborate conflict of interest that violated federal contracting regulations and could result in criminal prosecution if exposed by a public-spirited whistleblower. Sarah's excitement about these discoveries was palpable during her conversations with Rebecca, as she described her plans to compile evidence of my supposed corruption and present it to government oversight agencies that would be forced to investigate and prosecute such blatant violations of public trust. She had convinced herself that exposing my alleged crimes would not only destroy my business empire but also establish her as a principled advocate for government transparency who deserved recognition and career advancement for her public service. She thought she had beaten me. Sarah's belief that she had discovered the key to my destruction led to the most audacious and ultimately self-defeating move of her entire campaign against me, executed with the kind of overconfident precision that had characterized every major mistake she had made throughout our lifelong conflict. Armed with what she believed was irrefutable evidence of my financial vulnerability and government contract corruption, she convinced Blackstone Consulting to provide the legal and financial backing for a hostile acquisition attempt that would strip away my business empire while positioning her as the rightful heir to everything I had built through years of careful planning and ethical practice. The acquisition strategy was sophisticated enough to impress Sarah's ego while being fundamentally based on the false information I had deliberately leaked through Rebecca Martinez and other carefully constructed channels. Blackstone's attorneys had crafted a complex legal framework that would allow them to purchase Carter Strategic Solutions' outstanding debt obligations, force the company into bankruptcy proceedings, and then acquire its assets at dramatically reduced prices through court-supervised liquidation sales. Sarah would be installed as the new president of the reconstituted company, allowing her to claim credit for salvaging valuable client relationships and business assets from the wreckage of my supposed financial mismanagement. The legal maneuvering required to execute this acquisition took 6 weeks of intensive preparation, during which Sarah could barely contain her excitement about the impending reversal of our family's power dynamic. According to Rebecca's reports, Sarah spent hours describing her plans to transform my business contacts into her own professional network, explaining how she would use my established client relationships to build a consulting empire that would dwarf anything I had ever achieved. She had convinced herself that my success had always been built on foundations that she could replicate and improve upon, given proper resources and recognition. When the acquisition paperwork was finally completed and filed with the appropriate state agencies, Sarah's celebration was both public and vindictive in ways that revealed the depth of resentment she had harbored throughout our adult lives. She organized what she called a professional milestone party at the same country club where our parents had celebrated her supposed Harrison and Associates promotion, inviting family members, business associates, and media representatives to witness her transformation from marketing executive to business owner and CEO. The guest list for Sarah's victory celebration included our entire extended family, several colleagues from Harrison and Associates, representatives from Blackstone Consulting, and 3 local business journalists who were interested in the story of a successful marketing executive who had identified and acquired a struggling consulting firm with significant growth potential. Sarah's speech at the event was a masterpiece of self-congratulation and barely disguised hostility toward the sister she believed she had finally defeated after decades of perceived slights and unrecognized superiority. I've always believed that real business success comes from recognizing opportunities that others miss, Sarah announced to the assembled guests, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed she had achieved the ultimate vindication. When I discovered that Emma's consulting firm was struggling with serious financial and ethical problems, I knew I had both the expertise and the responsibility to step in and salvage what could be saved from the situation. The applause from family members was enthusiastic and sustained, reflecting their relief that the successful daughter had finally reclaimed her rightful position as the family's primary business achiever. Our mother dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, overcome with emotion at seeing Sarah receive the recognition she had always deserved. Our father nodded approvingly as Sarah described her plans to rebuild the company's reputation and restore ethical business practices that would serve as a model for the entire consulting industry. Local media coverage of the acquisition portrayed Sarah as a shrewd business executive who had identified undervalued assets and possessed the vision and resources necessary to transform a struggling company into a regional powerhouse. The Business Journal article included photographs of Sarah in her new executive office, surrounded by the corporate documents and strategic planning materials that she believed represented her conquest of my professional achievements. She granted interviews describing her rescue of valuable client relationships and her plans to expand the company's services into new market sectors that would generate unprecedented revenue growth. What made Sarah's celebration particularly satisfying to observe was her complete confidence that she had not only destroyed my business empire, but had also exposed me as a fraud whose success had been built on financial manipulation and government contract corruption that would soon result in criminal prosecution. She believed that the evidence she had provided to federal oversight agencies would lead to investigations that would permanently destroy my reputation, while establishing her as a principled whistleblower who deserved credit for exposing systemic corruption in government contracting processes. The irony that Sarah was completely oblivious to was that the company she had acquired with such elaborate legal maneuvering was nothing more than an empty shell corporation that I had specifically created to serve as bait for exactly this kind of hostile takeover attempt. MC Consulting LLC existed on paper as a legitimate business entity with impressive-sounding corporate documentation, but it possessed no real assets, no valuable client contracts, and no intellectual property worth acquiring. Every piece of tangible business value that Carter Strategic Solutions had developed over the years had been legally transferred to Horizon Solutions, Inc. 18 months earlier, through a carefully planned corporate restructuring that had been designed to protect my real assets from exactly the kind of attack Sarah had just executed. The shell company that Sarah now owned included a handful of obsolete office equipment, expired marketing materials, and a small checking account that contained just enough money to cover the final month's rent on a downtown office space that had already been vacated. The impressive client files that had convinced Blackstone's attorneys that this acquisition represented significant value were elaborate fakes that referenced contracts with companies that had either ceased operations or had never existed in the first place. But what she took wasn't mine, it was bait. The first cracks in Sarah's triumphant facade appeared exactly 72 hours after her victory celebration, when the mail delivery to her newly acquired office included a stack of legal documents that had been carefully timed to arrive once the acquisition paperwork was finalized, and her personal liability for MC Consulting LLC's obligations had become legally binding. The initial envelope contained a notice from the Internal Revenue Service regarding unpaid payroll taxes dating back 18 months, followed by a demand letter from the State Labor Department concerning worker compensation claims that had been filed but never resolved, and a third document from a commercial landlord claiming breach of lease agreements for office space that Sarah had never heard of but was now responsible for maintaining. These legal obligations had been strategically embedded within the Shell Corporation's structure, hidden beneath layers of corporate documentation that had appeared legitimate during Blackstone's due diligence process, but were designed to surface only after the acquisition had been completed, and Sarah's personal guarantees had made her individually responsible for all outstanding debts and liabilities. The total financial exposure was staggering, exceeding $200,000 in back taxes, penalties, and contractual obligations that would need to be resolved immediately to avoid criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that could destroy Sarah's personal credit and professional reputation. The brilliance of this trap lay in its complete legality, and the fact that every debt and obligation was technically legitimate, having been carefully constructed through actual business transactions that created real legal liabilities without generating any corresponding assets or revenue. Sarah had acquired a company that existed primarily as a vessel for financial obligations, and her celebration of this acquisition had been premature by any reasonable business standard. The due diligence process that Blackstone's attorneys had conducted had been deliberately misled by documentation that was accurate but incomplete, omitting crucial information about pending liabilities that would become the new owner's responsibility. Sarah's initial response to these revelations was denial and frantic attempts to shift responsibility back to me, claiming that I had deliberately concealed these obligations during the acquisition process and that she was the victim of fraudulent misrepresentation rather than the architect of her own downfall. However, Blackstone's legal team quickly determined that their due diligence had been adequate, according to standard business practices, and that Sarah's personal guarantees made her legally responsible for resolving these issues regardless of their origin or her awareness of them during the acquisition negotiations. The business community's reaction to Sarah's predicament was swift and merciless as word spread through professional networks that the consulting firm she had acquired with such fanfare was essentially worthless, and that her supposed business acumen had led her into a financial disaster that threatened to consume her personal assets and destroy her professional credibility. The journalist who had covered her victory celebration began asking pointed questions about her understanding of the company she had purchased, and whether her previous claims about identifying undervalued business opportunities had been based on genuine expertise or dangerous overconfidence. Most devastating to Sarah's psychological well-being was the realization that her family's celebration of her business triumph had been premature and embarrassing, transforming what she had intended as her moment of ultimate vindication into public evidence of her poor judgment and lack of business sophistication. The relatives who had applauded her acquisition strategy were now questioning whether she had been wise to involve herself in such a complex transaction, while the business associates who had attended her celebration party were distancing themselves from someone whose professional reputation was rapidly deteriorating. Blackstone Consulting's abandonment of Sarah was particularly brutal because it came at the moment when she most needed their support and resources to navigate the financial crisis that was consuming her newly acquired company. The partners who had enthusiastically backed her acquisition attempt quickly determined that their investment had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about the value of the assets they were purchasing, and their legal obligations to Sarah extended only to the completion of the acquisition transaction, rather than ongoing support for the business operations that followed. Marcus Webb, the Blackstone partner who had initially recruited Sarah and championed her acquisition proposal, delivered the news of their withdrawal during a conference call that Rebecca Martinez was able to monitor through the surveillance equipment that Sarah still believed was friendly emotional support. "We've determined that our strategic objectives are better served by focusing our resources on opportunities with clearer growth potential," Webb explained in the kind of corporate language that obscured personal criticism while making business realities unmistakably clear. The psychological impact of these reverses was evident in Sarah's behavior during family interactions, where her usual confidence and commanding presence had been replaced by defensive irritability and barely controlled panic about the financial obligations that were accumulating faster than she could address them. Her attempts to maintain her professional image while dealing with mounting legal and financial pressures created a level of stress that was visible to anyone who understood the warning signs of someone whose carefully constructed life was collapsing around them. More troubling for Sarah's long-term prospects was her growing recognition that the acquisition she had celebrated as evidence of her superior business intelligence had actually demonstrated exactly the opposite, revealing her vulnerability to manipulation by someone she had consistently underestimated throughout their lifelong conflict. The gradual realization that I had orchestrated her downfall through sophisticated planning that exploited her psychological weaknesses and character flaws was perhaps more damaging to her self-concept than the financial losses she was experiencing. The shell company's collapse had exposed Sarah as someone whose apparent business success had been built on foundations that crumbled under the first serious test of her independent judgment and strategic thinking abilities. The consulting clients who had worked with Harrison and Associates during her tenure there began questioning whether her contributions had been as valuable as they had assumed, while potential business partners who might have considered working with her new company reconsidered their assessments of her professional competence. And I was about to deliver the final blow. The confrontation that would finally strip away 34 years of carefully maintained family fiction occurred during our annual Christmas Eve gathering when Sarah arrived at our parents' house, carrying the kind of barely controlled rage that had been building since the collapse of her acquisition attempt had exposed the full extent of her miscalculation and my strategic superiority. The traditional holiday celebration was already underway, with 23 family members spread throughout the living room and dining room, engaged in the familiar rituals of gift exchange and nostalgic conversation that had characterized our family gatherings for decades. The atmosphere was warm and festive, making Sarah's explosive entrance all the more jarring for relatives who had no idea that the evening would end with revelations that would permanently alter their understanding of both daughters. Sarah's fury was immediately apparent to anyone who looked closely at her appearance and demeanor, from the tight set of her jaw to the way her hands trembled slightly as she hung her coat in the front hall closet. She had lost weight over the past month, her face showing the kind of stress-related gauntness that suggested sleepless nights and constant anxiety about the financial and legal problems that were consuming her life. More telling was the absence of her usual confident smile and commanding presence, replaced by a brittle energy that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. "Emma," she said, her voice cutting through the comfortable family conversation like a blade. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what you've done to me." The room fell silent as 23 pairs of eyes turned to witness what they assumed would be another minor sibling disagreement. The kind of holiday tension that occasionally surfaced when families spent extended time together. None of them were prepared for the volcanic eruption of accumulated resentment and fury that followed, as Sarah abandoned all pretense of sisterly affection and launched into a public attack that revealed the depths of hatred she had been harboring throughout our adult lives. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Sarah continued, her voice rising with each word as she positioned herself in the center of the living room where everyone could see and hear her clearly. "Manipulating me into that business deal, setting me up to fail, destroying everything I worked for just because you've always been jealous of my success. You've spent your entire life trying to tear me down because you couldn't stand that I was better than you at everything that mattered." The accusations poured out in a torrent of rage and self-pity that exposed not only Sarah's vindictive nature, but also her complete inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her own actions. She described our conflict as a one-sided attack by a jealous sister who had used unethical business practices to destroy an innocent victim, conveniently omitting any mention of her corporate espionage, character assassination campaigns, or conspiracy with my business competitors. Her version of events positioned her as the wronged party, whose only crime had been achieving the kind of professional success that I had always envied and resented. I waited until Sarah's initial outburst exhausted itself before responding with the calm, measured tone that I had learned to use in high-stakes business negotiations, where emotional control was essential for achieving strategic objectives. "Sarah," I said, reaching into my briefcase to retrieve the manila folder that contained Rebecca Martinez's surveillance reports and recorded conversations. "I think our family deserves to hear the complete truth about what's been happening between us, including some things you might have forgotten to mention." The evidence I presented was devastating in its comprehensiveness and impossible to dismiss or explain away through the kind of creative storytelling that Sarah had mastered over the years. I began with the recorded conversations in which she had detailed her corporate espionage activities and her conspiracy with Blackstone Consulting to steal confidential client information from my business. The audio quality was crystal clear, capturing not only Sarah's words, but also the vindictive pleasure in her voice as she described her plans to destroy my professional reputation and claim credit for my achievements. This is Sarah describing how she photographed confidential documents from Harrison and Associates and shared them with my business competitors. I explained to our horrified family members, playing excerpts that documented her breach of fiduciary duty and violation of corporate confidentiality agreements. And here she is explaining how she planned to frame my legitimate business success as evidence of criminal activity. The family's reaction was immediate and visceral, with shocked gasps and horrified expressions, replacing the comfortable holiday atmosphere that had prevailed just minutes earlier. Our parents sat frozen in their chairs, unable to process the revelation that their golden daughter had engaged in criminal activities that could have destroyed innocent people's livelihoods for no reason other than personal jealousy and vindictiveness. Our cousins and aunts and uncles stared at Sarah with the kind of disbelief reserved for discovering that someone you thought you knew had been living a complete lie. Sarah's attempts to justify her actions only deepened the hole she was digging with family members who had never seen this side of her personality. "You don't understand," she said, her voice becoming increasingly shrill and desperate as she realized that her usual charm and manipulation tactics were powerless against documented evidence of her criminal behavior. "Emma has been lying to all of you for years about how she built her business. She's not the innocent victim she's pretending to be." But her explanations rang hollow against the evidence of recorded conversations where she had gleefully described her plans to destroy my reputation through false accusations and fabricated evidence. The more she talked, the clearer it became to our family that they had been systematically deceived by someone whose public persona bore no resemblance to her true character. The woman they had celebrated and admired for years was revealed as someone capable of extraordinary vindictiveness and complete disregard for the well-being of others, including family members who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Our father's face had gone completely pale as he listened to his daughter describe corporate crimes that could have resulted in criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that would have destroyed innocent businesses and their employees. Our mother sat with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the extent to which her favoritism had enabled and encouraged behavior that violated every moral principle she had tried to instill in her children. But even cornered, she refused to surrender. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's failed attempt to maintain her innocence in the face of irrefutable evidence created a silence in the living room that stretched for nearly a full minute, broken only by the soft sound of our mother's crying and the uncomfortable shifting of relatives who had never witnessed such a complete demolition of someone's character and reputation. My parents sat frozen in their recliners, their faces reflecting the kind of dawning horror that comes with recognizing that everything you believed about your children had been fundamentally wrong for decades. The golden daughters they had celebrated and supported throughout her adult life had been revealed as someone capable of criminal behavior and vindictive cruelty, while the daughter they had dismissed and neglected had demonstrated integrity, intelligence, and professional success that they had been too blind to see. My father was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to process the implications of what he had just witnessed. "Emma," he said, his hands trembling as he reached toward me with a gesture that seemed to encompass both apology and desperate hope for forgiveness. "I don't know what to say. We had no idea that Sarah was capable of something like this, and we certainly never understood what you had accomplished on your own." The apology, when it finally came, was awkward and painful, in ways that revealed just how unprepared my parents were to confront the damage their favoritism had caused over the course of my entire life. My mother's attempt to explain their behavior was particularly difficult to listen to, as she struggled between genuine remorse and defensive justifications that suggested she still didn't fully grasp the scope of their failure as parents. "I always knew something wasn't quite right about the way we treated you girls," my mother admitted, dabbing at her eyes with tissues that our cousin Jennifer had quietly provided. "There were times when I would watch Sarah dismiss your achievements or make cruel comments about your struggles, and I knew I should say something, but it was just easier to go along with it than to create conflict in the family." The admission that she had consciously chosen the path of least resistance, rather than protecting me from systematic emotional abuse, was perhaps more painful than years of neglect had been, because it revealed that my suffering had been visible to her, but not important enough to justify the discomfort of confronting Sarah's behavior. My mother had prioritized family harmony over basic fairness, and her acknowledgement of this choice came 34 years too late to heal the damage it had caused. My father's attempts at reconciliation were equally problematic, characterized by the kind of grand gestures that suggested he believed decades of emotional neglect could be erased through dramatic declarations of newfound respect and appreciation. "We want to make this right, Emma," he said, his voice gaining strength as he convinced himself that good intentions could somehow compensate for a lifetime of poor judgment. "We'll change our will to reflect what we should have recognized years ago about your real character and achievements." The offer to redistribute their estate was both touching and deeply insulting, suggesting that my parents believed financial compensation could address emotional wounds that had shaped my entire approach to relationships and success. More troubling was their apparent assumption that I needed or wanted their inheritance, as if my demonstrated business success hadn't already proven my ability to create wealth through my own efforts and ethical practices. I maintained the same dignified composure that had served me well throughout this confrontation, refusing to allow their belated recognition to transform me into the grateful daughter they now seemed to expect. "I appreciate your apologies," I said, my voice steady and professional, despite the emotional chaos swirling around us. "But I need you to understand that forgiveness isn't something that can be rushed or demanded. You've spent 34 years teaching me not to expect fairness or support from this family, and changing that dynamic will require more than words and promises." The boundaries I established were clear and non-negotiable, designed to protect myself from the kind of emotional manipulation that my parents might unconsciously attempt as they struggled to process their guilt and shame. I explained that rebuilding any kind of meaningful relationship would require them to demonstrate sustained change in their behavior rather than expecting immediate absolution based on their newfound awareness of past mistakes. The extended family members who had witnessed this confrontation sat in uncomfortable silence, many of them recognizing that they had also participated in the systematic favoritism that had enabled Sarah's behavior while marginalizing my achievements. Cousins who had spent years praising Sarah's success while ignoring my professional accomplishments now looked embarrassed and uncertain about how to respond to revelations that called their own judgment into question. The most profound change was visible in how my parents looked at Sarah, whose desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative had only reinforced their growing understanding of her true character. The daughter they had indulged and celebrated for decades was revealed as someone whose charm and apparent success had masked a personality capable of extraordinary vindictiveness and moral corruption. The realization that their favoritism had not only damaged me, but had also enabled Sarah to develop into someone capable of criminal behavior, created a level of guilt and regret that would permanently alter their relationship with both daughters. Sarah herself seemed stunned by the completeness of her isolation, as family members who had automatically supported her throughout our lives now regarded her with suspicion and disappointment. The power dynamic that had governed our family for decades had been permanently reversed, leaving her without the foundation of unquestioned support that had enabled her manipulative behavior throughout our adult lives. The evening that had begun as a traditional Christmas celebration had been transformed into a moment of reckoning that would define our family relationships for whatever time remained with my parents. Finally understanding the true cost of their decades of poor judgment and willful blindness to the character differences between their daughters. And yet she still had one last weapon. Sarah's final desperate gambit came as she stood in the center of our parents' living room, surrounded by family members whose expressions had shifted from holiday warmth to horrified disappointment in the space of a single evening. With her professional reputation destroyed, her business empire collapsed, and her carefully constructed facade stripped away by irrefutable evidence of criminal behavior, she reached for the one weapon she believed could still inflict devastating damage on my claim to family belonging and parental love. Her voice took on the cruel, vindictive tone that I remembered from childhood moments when she had discovered particularly effective ways to hurt me, and her eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction as she prepared to deploy what she clearly believed was information that would destroy me more completely than anything she had attempted before. "You want to know the real truth about precious Emma?" Sarah said, her words dripping with venom as she turned to address our parents and extended family with theatrical drama. "She's not even really your daughter. She's adopted. Mom and Dad have been lying to all of us for 34 years, pretending that this outsider belongs in our family when she's nothing more than a charity case they took in and never had the courage to tell the truth about." The silence that followed Sarah's announcement was different from the shocked quiet that had characterized the earlier revelations, carrying an electric tension that suggested family secrets were finally being dragged into the light after decades of careful concealment. Our parents' faces went completely white, not with surprise at Sarah's revelation, but with horror that this information was being weaponized in such a cruel and public manner. Several relatives looked confused and uncertain, clearly trying to process information that explained certain family dynamics they had never fully understood but had never questioned directly. My response was calm and measured, delivered with the same professional composure that had served me well throughout this confrontation, despite the emotional chaos swirling around us. "I've known about my adoption since I was 16 years old," I said, watching Sarah's expression shift from triumphant satisfaction to dawning confusion as she realized her devastating revelation had failed to achieve its intended impact. "I found the paperwork while looking for my birth certificate for a summer job application, and I spent considerable time researching my biological family's history and the circumstances that led to my placement with your parents." The counter-revelation that I had possessed this knowledge for 18 years while allowing Sarah to believe she held a secret weapon transformed her moment of perceived triumph into another demonstration of her fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship and my character. Her assumption that learning about my adoption would devastate my sense of identity and belonging revealed how completely she had failed to understand that my worth and achievements were independent of biological connections to a family that had never truly accepted me, regardless of genetics. More importantly, my awareness of the adoption explained the lifelong pattern of favoritism and emotional neglect that had shaped our family dynamics in ways that our relatives were finally beginning to understand. This information clarifies a lot about why Sarah always received preferential treatment and why my achievements were consistently dismissed or minimized. I continued addressing the family members who were processing these revelations. It's much easier to neglect a child's emotional needs when you view them as fundamentally different from your real family. The most devastating response to Sarah's attack came when I retrieved the second manila folder from my briefcase containing documents that Patricia Worthington had helped me locate through her network of legal professionals who specialized in estate planning and probate research. "Since we're sharing family secrets tonight," I said, removing a set of legal documents that immediately captured my parents' attention. "I think you should all see the will that Dad actually wrote before his death, rather than the simplified version that was filed with the probate court." The real will, which had been discovered in a safety deposit box that my father had maintained separately from his primary banking relationships, contained language that revealed the depth of his guilt about the family's treatment of me and his recognition of Sarah's character flaws in ways that he had never been able to express during his lifetime. The document included a detailed letter explaining his decision to leave the majority of his estate to me not because of any lack of love for Sarah, but because of his growing concerns about her sense of entitlement and his desire to ensure that his assets would be used responsibly and ethically. "Emma has demonstrated the kind of integrity and work ethic that will honor our family's values." The letter read as I shared excerpts with our stunned relatives. "While Sarah's behavior has increasingly shown a level of selfishness and disregard for others that troubles me deeply, I believe Emma will use any inheritance to help others and build something meaningful, while Sarah would likely view it as validation of her existing sense of superiority and entitlement." The will also contained explicit instructions about revealing my adoption to the family in a manner that emphasized his pride in choosing me as his daughter and his belief that family bonds were created through love and shared values rather than biological connections. His words made it clear that he had never viewed me as less than a full family member, and that his failure to address the favoritism had been one of his greatest regrets rather than a reflection of my worth or belonging. Sarah's reaction to these revelations was a combination of rage and disbelief that her final weapon had not only failed to wound me, but had actually strengthened my position within the family while further exposing her own vindictive nature. The cruel satisfaction she had displayed when announcing my adoption was replaced by desperate fury as she realized that even this deeply personal attack had been anticipated and neutralized by someone she had consistently underestimated. The family members who witnessed Sarah's attempt to use my adoption as a weapon against me were visibly disgusted by the cruelty and calculated malice of her approach, particularly given that the information had been shared with the specific intent to cause maximum emotional damage during what should have been a moment of family reconciliation. Her willingness to weaponize personal information that could hurt both me and our parents demonstrated a level of vindictiveness that shocked even relatives who had begun to understand her capacity for manipulation and deception. Our parents' reaction was perhaps the most telling as they recognized that Sarah's use of my adoption as an attack revealed her complete lack of understanding about what family relationships should represent. Their horror was not about the information being shared, but about the malicious intent behind its revelation and what it demonstrated about their biological daughter's character and values. She pulled the trigger only to find I'd already taken the bullets. The complete destruction of Sarah's reputation and career began the following Monday morning when Patricia Worthington filed a comprehensive legal complaint with both state and federal authorities that detailed every aspect of Sarah's criminal conspiracy and provided the kind of irrefutable documentation that prosecutors dream of receiving in corporate espionage cases. The filing included Rebecca Martinez's recorded conversations, photographic evidence of document theft, financial records, proving the payments Sarah had received from Blackstone Consulting, and a detailed timeline that demonstrated the systematic nature of her crimes over a period of 18 months. Patricia had constructed the case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that Sarah's high-profile connections and family relationships might otherwise allow her to escape meaningful consequences for her actions. The business community's reaction to the revelations was swift and merciless, as word spread through professional networks that the marketing executive who had been celebrated for her rapid career advancement had actually built her success on stolen intelligence and criminal conspiracy. The Regional Business Journal published a front-page exposé that included excerpts from the recorded conversations where Sarah gleefully described her plans to destroy my reputation while positioning herself as the legitimate heir to my professional achievements. The article's headline, "Marketing Executive Charged with Corporate Espionage and Fraud," was accompanied by Sarah's professional headshot and a detailed timeline of her criminal activities that made her guilt undeniable. Harrison and Associates faced immediate damage control challenges as their clients questioned whether their confidential information had been compromised and whether the firm could be trusted to maintain basic security protocols. David Harrison was forced to conduct emergency meetings with every major client, providing detailed explanations about the security measures that would prevent future breaches, while offering contract modifications that included additional privacy protections and reduced fees to compensate for the breach of trust. 3 clients immediately terminated their relationships with the firm, representing nearly 40% of Harrison and Associates' annual revenue, and forcing David to lay off 12 employees whose positions could no longer be sustained. The legal consequences that followed were comprehensive and devastating, designed to ensure that Sarah would never again be in a position to harm innocent businesses or individuals through corporate espionage or character assassination. The criminal charges included theft of trade secrets, computer fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal laws governing corporate confidentiality agreements. The civil lawsuit that Patricia filed simultaneously sought restitution for damages to my business reputation, compensation for the costs of investigating and documenting Sarah's crimes, and punitive damages that would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar attacks on legitimate businesses. More damaging to Sarah's long-term prospects was the permanent industry blacklisting that resulted from the widespread publicity surrounding her case. Professional associations revoked her marketing certifications, industry publications, added her name to databases that tracked individuals barred from consulting work, and executive recruiters throughout the region received detailed briefings about her criminal history and the security risks associated with hiring someone who had demonstrated such complete disregard for confidentiality agreements and ethical business practices. The psychological impact of this comprehensive destruction of everything Sarah had claimed to value about professional success was evident during the court proceedings, where she appeared increasingly desperate and unstable as the full extent of her legal jeopardy became clear. Her attempts to minimize her criminal behavior or blame external pressures for her choices were systematically dismantled by Patricia's presentation of evidence that demonstrated the premeditated and sustained nature of her conspiracy against my business and reputation. Sarah's final attempt to escape consequences came in the form of a tearful public apology delivered outside the courthouse steps, where she claimed to have been misled by bad advice and expressed remorse for actions that she characterized as mistakes rather than deliberate crimes. The performance was carefully choreographed by her defense attorney, who had advised her that demonstrating genuine remorse might result in reduced criminal penalties and civil damages. Her words were directed specifically at me, delivered with the kind of manufactured emotion that she had used throughout our lives to manipulate family members and authority figures. Emma, I know I made terrible mistakes, and I'm begging you to find it in your heart to forgive me. Sarah said, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but which I recognized as the same calculated manipulation she had employed since childhood. I was jealous and angry, and I let those feelings push me into doing things that I would never normally consider. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right and rebuild the relationship we should have had as sisters. My response was delivered with the same professional composure that had characterized my behavior throughout this entire conflict, refusing to allow Sarah's tears or family pressure to compromise the justice that had been so long in coming. Sarah, I said, my voice carrying clearly to the assembled reporters and family members who had gathered to witness this final chapter. Your apology might mean something if it had come before you were caught, prosecuted, and facing serious legal consequences for your actions. As it stands, it appears to be motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. The boundaries I established were clear and non-negotiable, designed to protect myself from future manipulation while ensuring that Sarah understood the permanent nature of the consequences she had earned through her choices. I explained that forgiveness was not something that could be demanded or negotiated, and that her focus should be on accepting responsibility for her crimes rather than seeking absolution from the people she had harmed through years of systematic deception and vindictive attacks. The final legal settlement required Sarah to pay substantial restitution for damages to my business, surrender any remaining assets from the shell company acquisition, and accept a permanent injunction that prohibited her from working in consulting or marketing roles where she might have access to confidential business information. The criminal plea agreement resulted in 2 years of supervised probation, community service requirements, and permanent notation on her record that would prevent her from obtaining professional licenses or bonding that would be required for most business positions. And for the first time, she looked truly afraid. The fear that had finally appeared in Sarah's eyes during our courthouse confrontation marked the beginning of a carefully measured response that would demonstrate the difference between justice and revenge, between proportional consequences and vindictive cruelty. In the weeks that followed the legal settlement, I found myself in the unique position of holding complete power over someone who had spent our entire lives treating me as inferior. Yet I discovered that the satisfaction I felt came not from her suffering, but from the knowledge that I had risen above the toxic patterns that had defined our family relationships for decades. My approach to Sarah's downfall was guided by principles that I had learned through years of ethical business practices and professional integrity, refusing to allow her criminal behavior to transform me into someone capable of the same vindictiveness and moral corruption that had characterized her attacks on my reputation and livelihood. When family members and business associates suggested that I should use my position to inflict additional punishment or public humiliation on Sarah, I consistently declined to participate in the kind of character assassination that she had employed against me. The boundaries I established were firm, but not cruel, designed to protect myself and others from future harm, while allowing Sarah to maintain basic human dignity despite the consequences she had earned through her choices. When she requested a private meeting to discuss her financial situation and employment prospects, I agreed to see her in my office, treating her with the same professional courtesy that I would extend to any former business associate who had been involved in criminal activities but was attempting to rebuild their life through legitimate means. I'm not going to pretend that we can have a normal family relationship after everything that's happened, I told Sarah during that meeting, my voice calm but unmistakably final. Your actions caused real harm to innocent people, and the consequences you're experiencing are the natural result of choices you made repeatedly over a period of years. However, I'm not interested in making your situation worse than it already is, and I won't participate in efforts to prevent you from finding legitimate employment or rebuilding your life through honest work. The conversation revealed Sarah's complete inability to understand the distinction between justice and revenge, as she seemed genuinely confused by my refusal to either forgive her crimes or actively work to destroy her remaining prospects for future employment. Her worldview had been shaped by the same toxic family dynamics that had taught her to see relationships in terms of dominance and submission, rather than mutual respect and ethical behavior, making it impossible for her to comprehend that someone might choose restraint and dignity over the kind of vindictive satisfaction she would have pursued in my position. My decision to maintain professional boundaries rather than personal hostility served multiple purposes, demonstrating to the business community that I possessed the kind of emotional maturity and ethical consistency that would make me a trustworthy partner for future collaborations. The restraint I showed in my treatment of Sarah became part of my professional reputation, with several business leaders commenting privately that my handling of a deeply personal betrayal had convinced them that I could be trusted to maintain confidentiality and act with integrity even under extreme pressure. More importantly, my response to Sarah's downfall proved to myself that I had become the kind of person I had needed during the lonely years of childhood neglect and adult struggle. Someone who possessed enough inner strength and moral clarity to resist the temptation to inflict unnecessary suffering, even on someone who had caused tremendous harm. The satisfaction I felt was not derived from Sarah's pain, but from the knowledge that I had maintained my principles and proven that success built on ethical foundations was stronger than victories achieved through manipulation and cruelty. The justice that Sarah experienced was comprehensive but proportional, ensuring that she would face meaningful consequences for her crimes while preserving the possibility that she might eventually learn from her mistakes and build a better life through honest effort and genuine personal growth. The legal system had imposed appropriate penalties for her corporate espionage and fraud. The business community had responded with justified skepticism about her trustworthiness, and our family had finally seen her true character revealed through her own actions and choices. My refusal to participate in vindictive attacks on Sarah's remaining dignity extended to conversations with family members who wanted to discuss her situation with the kind of gossip and schadenfreude that had characterized our family's approach to conflict throughout my childhood. When relatives called to share details about Sarah's struggles with employment or housing, I politely declined to engage in those conversations, explaining that my focus was on moving forward with my own life, rather than monitoring the consequences of her choices. The transformation that this experience had created in my relationship with our parents was equally measured and principled, as I maintained respectful boundaries while refusing to pretend that their belated apologies could erase decades of damage or immediately restore trust that had been systematically destroyed through years of favoritism and emotional neglect. I acknowledged their recognition of past mistakes, while making it clear that rebuilding any meaningful relationship would require sustained evidence of genuine change rather than dramatic gestures or financial compensation. The business success that had emerged from this conflict was deeply satisfying, not because it had been achieved at Sarah's expense, but because it represented the culmination of years of ethical practice and strategic thinking that had proven more powerful than any form of manipulation or deception. The Horizon Development Project was proceeding ahead of schedule. My consulting firm was receiving referrals from clients who respected my integrity, and the professional relationships I had built were stronger than ever because they were based on mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. But I wasn't finished yet. The revelation that would fundamentally transform my understanding of identity and belonging came through Patricia Worthington's exhaustive legal research into my adoption records, a process that she had initiated as part of ensuring that Sarah's attempts to weaponize my family status could never be used against me in future legal proceedings. What Patricia discovered through her network of genealogical researchers and legal historians exceeded anything either of us had anticipated, revealing not only the circumstances of my placement with the Carter family, but also the extraordinary background of the biological parents who had made the difficult decision to ensure my future through adoption, rather than attempting to raise me themselves under impossible circumstances. The investigation revealed that my birth mother, Catherine Meridian, had been the youngest daughter of the Meridian Foundation, one of the most respected philanthropic dynasties in American history, whose charitable work had funded hospitals, universities, and social service organizations across 3 generations of family leadership. Catherine had become pregnant at 19 during her sophomore year at Yale, the result of a relationship with a fellow student whose family had disowned him upon learning of the situation, leaving 2 young people with no resources to provide the kind of stable, financially secure environment that would give their child the best possible start in life. The decision to place me for adoption had been made with the kind of careful consideration that characterized the Meridian family's approach to all major decisions, involving extensive research into potential families and detailed legal arrangements that would ensure my well-being while protecting my biological parents' privacy during a time when unwed pregnancy carried significant social stigma even among progressive families. Catherine had specifically requested that I be placed with a middle-class family where my intelligence and work ethic would be valued and developed, believing that growing up with modest means would teach me resilience and character that inherited wealth might not provide. Patricia's research had attracted the attention of the Meridian Foundation's current leadership, which included my biological uncle Harrison Meridian, who had been searching for me for over 5 years with the help of private investigators and genealogical experts. The family had always intended to make contact once I reached adulthood, but the adoption agency's records had been damaged in a fire, making it impossible to locate me until Patricia's legal inquiries had provided the missing links that enabled them to confirm my identity through DNA analysis and birth records. The initial contact came through a formal letter delivered by Patricia, written in Harrison Meridian's distinctive handwriting on foundation letterhead that reflected the institutional gravitas of an organization that had donated over $200 million to charitable causes throughout its century-long history. The letter was warm but respectful, acknowledging the complexity of contacting someone who had built a successful life without knowledge of their biological family's existence, while expressing genuine excitement about the possibility of developing a relationship based on shared values rather than obligation or expectation. "We have followed your professional achievements with tremendous pride and admiration," Harrison wrote, "recognizing in your ethical business practices and commitment to helping others the same principles that have guided our family's philanthropic work for generations. Your success has been achieved entirely through your own efforts and character, making it all the more remarkable and worthy of celebration." The meeting that followed took place in Harrison's office within the Meridian Foundation headquarters, an elegant building that housed one of the most influential charitable organizations in the country, while maintaining an atmosphere of understated professionalism that reflected the family's preference for substance over ostentation. Harrison himself was a distinguished man in his early 60s, whose genuine warmth and intellectual curiosity immediately explained Catherine's decision to trust this family with information about her daughter's achievements and character. The offer that Harrison presented was both generous and carefully structured to respect my independence, while providing opportunities that would amplify my existing charitable inclinations and business expertise. The Meridian Foundation was prepared to name me as Catherine's heir, providing an immediate inheritance of $12 million, plus a leadership position within the foundation that would allow me to direct charitable giving worth approximately $50 million annually. The role would draw upon my consulting experience while providing resources to help businesses and individuals in ways that aligned perfectly with my professional interests and personal values. "We're not offering you this inheritance because of biology." Harrison explained, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who had spent decades evaluating the character and motivations of people seeking foundation support. "We're offering it because your demonstrated integrity and business acumen make you exactly the kind of person our family has always hoped would carry forward our commitment to using wealth responsibly and effectively." The decision I faced was profound in ways that went far beyond financial considerations, representing a choice between accepting the security and influence that inherited wealth could provide versus maintaining the independence and self-determination that had been the foundation of everything I had achieved throughout my adult life. The Meridian Foundation represented an opportunity to amplify my charitable impact while working with resources that could transform thousands of lives, but accepting their offer would also mean acknowledging that my success had been incomplete without their recognition and support. After 3 weeks of careful consideration and multiple conversations with Harrison about the foundation's history and operations, I made the decision that surprised everyone involved, including Patricia, who had assumed that any rational person would accept such an extraordinary opportunity for financial security and philanthropic influence. My choice was based on principles that had been forged through years of struggle and the knowledge that my greatest strength lay in the confidence that came from building something meaningful entirely through my own efforts and ethical choices. "I'm deeply honored by your offer and grateful for the opportunity to connect with my biological family," I told Harrison during our final meeting, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was declining. "However, I've learned that my sense of worth and achievement comes from knowing that everything I've built has been earned through my own work and principles. Accepting an inheritance, regardless of how generously it's offered, would change the foundation of my self-respect in ways that might ultimately diminish, rather than enhance my ability to help others." The decision to refuse $12 million and a position of enormous influence within one of America's most respected charitable organizations represented the culmination of everything I had learned about identity success and the sources of genuine satisfaction throughout my journey from neglected child to successful business owner. My true victory had never been about accumulating wealth or gaining recognition from others, but about proving to myself that integrity and hard work could overcome any obstacle and create a life of meaning and purpose. Harrison's response to my decision was gracious and understanding, reflecting the kind of character that had made the Meridian family successful stewards of inherited wealth for over a century. He assured me that the foundation's doors would always remain open and that my choice to maintain independence actually increased, rather than diminished, their respect for my character and judgment. I had one last lesson for everyone to learn. The lesson I intended to teach through my final act in this long drama required transforming the house where I had experienced decades of emotional neglect and systematic favoritism into something that would honor the struggles of other women who had faced similar challenges, while demonstrating that painful experiences could become the foundation for meaningful positive change. The opportunity to purchase my childhood home arose 6 months after my parents had moved into a retirement community, unable to maintain the large property that had housed 40 years of family memories and toxic dynamics that they were finally ready to acknowledge and leave behind. The real estate transaction was handled through Patricia Worthington's law firm to ensure complete confidentiality and prevent any family interference with my plans for the property, which I knew would be controversial among relatives who might have preferred to see the house sold to a traditional family that would preserve its residential character rather than convert it into a facility that would serve as a permanent reminder of our family's failures and redemption. The purchase price of $450,000 was paid in cash from my business accounts, eliminating any financing contingencies that might have complicated the acquisition or delayed the renovation timeline I had established for transforming the space. The renovation process took 8 months and required the expertise of architects, contractors, and interior designers who specialized in creating therapeutic environments for people recovering from traumatic experiences. The formal dining room where I had endured countless family dinners became a comfortable meeting space with soft lighting and furniture arranged to encourage conversation and mutual support. The living room where Sarah had held court for decades was transformed into a library and computer center where women could develop job skills and access educational resources that would help them rebuild their professional lives after escaping abusive relationships or overcoming family rejection. The kitchen where my mother had prepared meals while discussing my shortcomings and Sarah's achievements became a teaching space where participants could learn culinary skills that would provide both therapeutic value and practical employment opportunities in the hospitality industry. My former bedroom, where I had spent countless nights planning my escape from family dynamics that made me feel worthless and unwanted, was converted into an office for individual counseling sessions with professional therapists who specialized in helping women overcome the psychological damage caused by toxic family relationships and emotional abuse. The New Horizons Center officially opened on a crisp October morning with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by local government officials, mental health professionals, and business leaders who had contributed funding and expertise to support the facility's mission of helping women rebuild their lives after experiencing family trauma, domestic abuse, or other circumstances that had left them isolated and without traditional support systems. The media coverage emphasized the center's innovative approach to combining practical skills training with psychological counseling and peer support, creating a comprehensive program that addressed both the emotional and financial challenges faced by women who were starting over after devastating personal setbacks. The irony that made this transformation particularly meaningful was my decision to hire staff members who understood the challenges faced by the women we served because they had experienced similar struggles in their own lives, creating an environment where healing could occur through shared understanding rather than condescending charity from people who had never faced serious adversity. The program coordinators included women who had escaped abusive marriages, overcome addiction, survived family rejection due to sexual orientation, or rebuilt their lives after financial disasters that had destroyed their previous sense of security and self-worth. The most unexpected aspect of the center's early operations was the employment application I received from Sarah, who had spent 6 months unsuccessfully seeking professional positions that would utilize her marketing background while providing income sufficient to cover her basic living expenses and legal obligations. The application was submitted through the center's standard hiring process with no indication that she expected special consideration based on our family relationship, or any assumption that I would either automatically reject or accept her request for employment. The interview process was conducted by Rebecca Martinez, who had transitioned from private investigation work to serving as the center's human resources director, bringing her skills in reading people's motivations and character to the task of identifying staff members who would contribute positively to the therapeutic environment we were creating. Rebecca's assessment of Sarah was thorough and professional, focusing on her ability to perform assigned tasks reliably while maintaining appropriate boundaries with program participants who might be vulnerable to manipulation or exploitation. She's genuinely desperate and appears to understand that this represents her only realistic employment opportunity, Rebecca reported during our weekly staff meeting. Her attitude during the interview was humble and respectful, without any of the entitlement or superiority I observed during my undercover work. She seems to recognize that she's applying for an entry-level position and appears willing to accept whatever responsibilities we assign without complaint or attempts to negotiate for special treatment. The position I offered Sarah was custodial work that included cleaning the facility's common areas, maintaining the grounds, and providing basic maintenance support for the building systems that kept the center operational. The job paid $15 per hour for a 30-hour work week, providing enough income to cover her essential expenses, while requiring her to demonstrate the kind of consistent, honest effort that she had never been required to maintain during her previous career in marketing and corporate manipulation. The decision to hire Sarah was based on principles, rather than sentiment, representing my belief that redemption was possible for anyone willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to earning respect through honest work, rather than demanding recognition based on family connections or false claims about past achievements. The employment agreement included strict guidelines about her interactions with program participants, prohibiting any discussion of our family relationship or attempts to position herself as anything other than a maintenance worker whose job was to support the center's operations without interfering in the therapeutic programs. Watching Sarah perform custodial duties in the house where she had once lorded her supposed superiority over me was initially surreal, but it quickly became a source of quiet satisfaction as I observed her developing work habits that were based on contributing value, rather than manipulating others for personal advantage. She arrived promptly each morning, completed her assigned tasks without complaint, and maintained professional relationships with other staff members who knew nothing about her criminal history or our family conflicts. The transformation was not dramatic or emotionally cathartic, but rather a gradual process of Sarah learning to find dignity through honest labor and consistent performance, rather than through the kind of manipulation and false claims that had characterized her previous approach to achieving recognition and status. Her work was competent, if not exceptional, and her attitude remained appropriately humble throughout the probationary period that would determine whether her employment would continue beyond the initial 6-month trial period. The broader success of the New Horizons Center exceeded my expectations, with a waiting list of women seeking admission to programs that combined practical skills, training with psychological support in ways that addressed the complex challenges faced by people rebuilding their lives after traumatic experiences. The facility's reputation attracted funding from foundations and government agencies that recognized the effectiveness of our comprehensive approach to helping women achieve genuine independence, rather than temporary assistance that failed to address underlying issues. But then came the letter that changed everything one final time. The letter that arrived at the New Horizons Center 18 months after our opening ceremony was written on elegant cream-colored stationery bearing the Meridian Foundation letterhead delivered by private courier, with the kind of formal presentation that suggested its contents were of particular significance to the sender. Harrison Meridian's distinctive handwriting filled 3 pages with observations and reflections that demonstrated the thoroughness with which my biological family had been following the center's development and the impact our programs were having on women throughout the region who had found healing and hope through our comprehensive approach to rebuilding lives after traumatic experiences. Your decision to decline our inheritance offer initially surprised us, Harrison wrote in his characteristic style that combined intellectual precision with genuine warmth. But observing what you have accomplished with resources you earned through your own efforts has convinced us that your choice reflected wisdom and character that surpasses anything we might have taught you through conventional family relationships. The New Horizons Center represents exactly the kind of innovative philanthropy that our foundation has always aspired to support, combining practical assistance with genuine respect for the dignity and potential of every person who seeks help. The letter continued with detailed observations about the center's success metrics, including graduation rates that exceeded industry standards for similar programs, employment, placement percentages that demonstrated the effectiveness of our skills, training components and testimonials from program participants whose lives had been transformed through the combination of psychological support and practical education that we provided. Harrison had clearly invested considerable time in researching our operations and outcomes, approaching his evaluation with the same rigorous methodology that had made the Meridian Foundation one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country. More importantly, the letter concluded, "Your work demonstrates an understanding of true philanthropy that goes beyond simply providing financial assistance to address the underlying causes of the problems people face." The women who graduate from your programs don't just receive temporary help, they develop the skills, confidence, and support networks that enable them to build sustainable, independent lives that break cycles of trauma and dependency that might otherwise continue for generations. The validation that Harrison's words provided was particularly meaningful because it came from someone whose entire life had been devoted to evaluating charitable work and distinguishing between programs that created genuine positive change versus those that merely provided temporary relief without addressing systemic issues. His recognition that my approach to helping others reflected principles and values that aligned with the Meridian family's philanthropic philosophy suggested that my biological heritage included not just financial resources, but also a commitment to using privilege and opportunity responsibly. The daily operations of the New Horizons Center had settled into rhythms that reflected both the therapeutic needs of our participants and the practical requirements of maintaining a facility that served as both sanctuary and training ground for women rebuilding their lives. Sarah's role within this environment had evolved from probationary employee to reliable staff member whose consistent performance and appropriate boundaries had earned the respect of colleagues who knew nothing about her criminal history or our family relationship. She arrived each morning at 7:30, completed her custodial responsibilities with quiet efficiency, and left each afternoon without attempting to insert herself into therapeutic programs or administrative decisions that were beyond her assigned duties. The transformation in Sarah's demeanor and work habits was genuine rather than performative, suggesting that honest labor and clear expectations had provided structure and purpose that her previous career in manipulation and corporate espionage had never offered. She took pride in maintaining the facility's appearance and functionality, understanding that her work contributed to creating an environment where healing could occur and women could develop the confidence necessary to rebuild their lives. The satisfaction she derived from these contributions was evident in her punctuality, attention to detail, and willingness to accept additional responsibilities when facility needs required extra effort. The most profound moments at the center occurred when I had opportunities to work directly with women whose experiences mirrored aspects of my own journey, from family rejection to self-sufficiency and purpose. These interactions reminded me daily that my personal struggles had been preparation for understanding and addressing the complex challenges faced by people who had been told they were worthless, unwanted, or incapable of achieving meaningful success through their own efforts and character. One such moment came during my weekly intake interview with Maria Rodriguez, a 26-year-old woman whose family had disowned her after she refused to remain in an abusive marriage that her parents had arranged for financial reasons. Maria's story included elements that resonated deeply with my own experiences. Family members who prioritized maintaining comfortable illusions over protecting someone they claimed to love, systematic emotional abuse disguised as concern for her well-being, and the devastating isolation that comes from realizing that people who should provide unconditional support have instead become sources of additional trauma and rejection. "I don't understand how they can choose him over me," Maria said during our conversation, her voice carrying the bewildered pain that I remembered from my own moments of recognizing that my family's loyalty was conditional rather than genuine. "I'm their daughter, but they act like preserving their relationship with his family is more important than my safety or happiness." My response drew upon lessons learned through decades of navigating family dysfunction and the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from building a life based on my own values, rather than seeking approval from people whose judgment was fundamentally flawed. "The most difficult truth about toxic family relationships," I told Maria, "is that some people are incapable of loving others in healthy ways even when those others are their own children. Your worth isn't determined by their inability to see it, and your future isn't limited by their failure to support it." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering practical strategies for building independent support networks, professional development opportunities that would provide financial security, and psychological frameworks for understanding that family rejection often reflects the limitations of the people doing the rejecting rather than deficiencies in the person being rejected. By the end of our session, Maria's posture had straightened and her voice had gained strength, suggesting that she was beginning to internalize the possibility that her family's treatment of her was a reflection of their character rather than her value. These interactions occurred regularly throughout my work at the center, each one reinforcing my understanding that personal healing becomes complete only when it enables someone to help others navigate similar challenges with greater wisdom and support than they themselves had received. The women who graduated from our programs often remained connected to the center as volunteers and mentors, creating networks of mutual support that extended far beyond the formal structure of our therapeutic and educational offerings. The full-circle nature of my journey became clear during quiet moments when I reflected on the contrast between the humiliated child who had sat silently through family dinners while being dismissed and belittled, and the confident woman who now provided guidance and resources to others facing similar rejection and psychological abuse. The painful experiences that had once seemed like evidence of my inadequacy had been transformed into sources of insight and compassion that enabled me to help others recognize their own strength and potential. Sarah's presence in the building where she had once treated me with contempt served as a daily reminder that people could change when circumstances required them to confront the consequences of their choices and develop new ways of finding meaning and purpose. Her transformation was not dramatic or emotionally satisfying in the way that fiction might portray, but rather a gradual process of learning to derive satisfaction from honest contribution rather than manipulative domination. The success of the New Horizons Center had exceeded every metric we had established during the planning phase, with waiting lists for admission recognition from state and federal agencies, and requests for consultation from organizations seeking to replicate our model in other communities. The facility had become a demonstration that healing from family trauma was not only possible, but could become the foundation for creating positive change that extended far beyond individual recovery to influence entire communities and generations. That family dinner ended everything I used to be, but began everything I was meant to become. That family dinner ended everything I used to be, but began everything I was meant to become. Looking back now, I understand that the pain we experience in toxic family relationships often serves a purpose we can't see while we're living through it. Every moment of rejection, every instance of being overlooked or dismissed, every time we're made to feel less than we are, these experiences can become the foundation for developing strength, empathy, and wisdom that would be impossible to gain any other way. The skills I learned while surviving my family's favoritism, resilience, self-reliance, the ability to see through manipulation, became exactly the qualities I needed to build a successful business and help other women escape similar situations. If you're listening to this story and recognizing parts of your own life in my experiences, I want you to know that you're not alone and, more importantly, you're not powerless. Family dysfunction can make us feel isolated and convinced that we're somehow flawed or unworthy of love and respect. But the truth is that toxic family patterns say everything about the people perpetuating them and nothing about your value as a human being. You didn't cause these problems, you can't control other people's behavior, and you don't have to accept treatment that diminishes your self-worth or limits your potential. The path forward begins with understanding that healing from family trauma is not about getting revenge or forcing others to acknowledge the pain they've caused. Real healing happens when we stop waiting for toxic people to change and start building lives that reflect our own values and goals. This doesn't mean cutting off all contact with difficult family members, though sometimes that becomes necessary for our own well-being. It means developing the emotional independence to pursue our dreams and build healthy relationships, regardless of whether our family of origin supports or understands our choices. Many people today are finding healing through therapy support groups and self-help resources that provide practical tools for breaking free from toxic family patterns. Online communities have created spaces where people can share their experiences without judgment and learn from others who have walked similar paths. Professional counseling can help us understand how childhood experiences affect our adult relationships and decision-making processes, while also teaching us healthier ways to communicate and set boundaries with difficult people. Some find comfort in spiritual practices that emphasize forgiveness and personal growth, while others benefit from creative outlets like writing art or music that allow them to process complex emotions and transform painful experiences into something meaningful. Physical activities like yoga, running, or martial arts can help release trauma stored in the body while building confidence and resilience. The key is finding approaches that resonate with your personality and circumstances, understanding that healing is not a one-size-fits-all process. The most important lesson I learned through my journey is that we don't have to remain victims of our circumstances. Every day we have the choice to either repeat the patterns we grew up with or create something better. This choice isn't always easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's always available to us. We can choose to treat others with the kindness we wished we had received. We can choose to build families, whether biological or chosen, based on mutual respect and genuine love. We can choose to use our experiences to help others, rather than allowing bitterness to consume our potential for happiness. The work I do at the New Horizons Center has taught me that healing multiplies when we share it with others. Every woman who graduates from our program goes into the world with skills and confidence that she passes on to her children, friends, and community. This creates ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can measure or track, changing entire family trees and breaking cycles of dysfunction that might otherwise continue for generations. If you're currently struggling with family relationships that leave you feeling unseen, unvalued, or constantly criticized, please remember that your family's inability to appreciate you doesn't define your worth or limit your possibilities. You have unique gifts and talents that the world needs, even if the people closest to you haven't recognized them yet. Building a life that honors your authentic self might require difficult conversations, uncomfortable boundaries, or even periods of distance from people you love. But the alternative, sacrificing your potential to maintain relationships that diminish rather than celebrate who you are, is ultimately more painful for everyone involved. Start small if you need to. Set one boundary. Pursue one interest that brings you joy. Connect with one person who sees and values your authentic self. Each step you take toward honoring your own worth makes the next step easier and strengthens your ability to create the life you deserve. Remember that healing is not about becoming perfect or never feeling hurt again. It's about developing the skills and support systems that allow you to navigate challenges with grace and maintain your sense of self even when others try to convince you that you're less than you are. The story you've just heard took place over several years, but the principles it illustrates can be applied starting today, right where you are with whatever resources you currently have available. You don't need a business empire or a dramatic confrontation to begin reclaiming your power and building a life that reflects your values. You just need the courage to take the first step toward becoming the person you were meant to be before toxic relationships convinced you that you were somehow flawed or unworthy. If this story has resonated with you and you'd like to hear more about overcoming life's challenges and building authentic success, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. We share stories and insights that celebrate resilience, personal growth, and the triumph of the human spirit over difficult circumstances. Together, we can create a community where everyone's voice is valued and no one has to face their struggles alone.